A 9-year-old boy walked into a diner full of outlaw bikers at midnight during the worst blizzard to hit the Appalachian Mountains in 40 years. Carrying a black duffel bag he begged no one to open. Inside that bag was evidence that could destroy a child trafficking network stretching across 2 states. Outside, headlights were already cutting through the storm. The men hunting him had guns, money, and badges. The only thing standing between that boy and the darkness chasing him was a scarred Marine with blood on his knuckles and a motorcycle club that the entire county feared. But here's the thing nobody expected. The most dangerous men in those mountains were about to become the only ones willing to protect a child the whole system had already abandoned. Stay with this one all the way to the end. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The snow came sideways across Interstate 81 like something fleeing the mountains, thick sheets of white tearing across black asphalt and swallowing every guardrail, every road sign, every trace of civilization until there was nothing left but the howl of wind and the muffled growl of engines somewhere beneath it. Visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet, the kind of night where smart people stayed home, where truckers pulled off at rest stops and killed their rigs and waited it out with bad vending machine coffee and static-choked AM radio. The kind of night where the mountains themselves seemed to close in tighter, pressing down with the weight of frozen rock and dead timber, and the ancient indifference of a landscape that did not care whether you survived or not. Del Mercer rolled his Harley into the gravel lot of Black Lantern Diner just past midnight, his leather cut stiff with frost, his fingers nearly locked around the handlebars. The neon sign above the entrance buzzed and flickered, half the letters dead, the rest bleeding a weak pink glow across the snow-covered pavement. He killed the engine. Sat there a moment in the silence that always came after shutting down a bike in weather like this, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made the cold feel personal. He swung off the saddle, his boots crunching through 3 inches of fresh powder, and stood there looking at the diner like a man deciding whether the warmth inside was worth the effort of walking 20 feet to reach it. They called him Graves, had for years. Not because he dug them, though some men in certain towns believed otherwise, but because he carried the dead with him everywhere he went. 2 tours in Fallujah. A marriage that ended in a parking lot outside a VA hospital when his wife told him she couldn't sleep next to someone who screamed in languages she didn't understand. A daughter he hadn't seen in 4 years because a family court judge decided a man with a motorcycle club patch and a PTSD diagnosis wasn't fit to raise a child in a stable environment. The judge had never asked what stable meant to a man who'd held a dying corporal in a ditch outside Ramadi, while mortar shells turned the sky into noise. Graves didn't argue. He just stopped talking to people who expected answers that fit inside their paperwork. He pushed through the diner door and the heat hit him like a wall. Stale coffee, bacon grease baked into every surface, the low murmur of voices and the clatter of ceramic on formica. Half the booths were occupied by men wearing the same cut he wore. The Iron Vulture's MC patch stitched across the back, a black vulture perched on a rusted iron cross, wings spread wide. They'd been riding together since before the storm hit, a convoy of 12 heading south from a Brotherhood funeral in Pennsylvania, and the weather had forced them off the highway one by one until they all ended up here, stranded in this diner on the edge of nowhere, in the Cumberland Gap country where Tennessee bled into Kentucky and Virginia, and nobody kept close track of which state you were standing in. Rook was in the far booth, a man built like a shipping container, 6'5" and close to 300 pounds, with hands that could palm a basketball and a voice so low it sometimes vibrated the table when he spoke. Former Army combat engineer, 3 deployments. He'd come home to find his fiancée had sold his truck, emptied his bank account, and moved in with his cousin in Roanoke. He didn't chase her, didn't make a phone call, just rode south until he found the Iron Vultures and never rode back north again. He sat now with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, staring at nothing, the way men stared when they were looking at something only they could see. Beside him sat Deacon, the club's sergeant-at-arms, a wiry former Marine Scout sniper with a prosthetic left hand he never bothered hiding and never bothered explaining. His face was all angles, sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset by someone who didn't care about symmetry. He was reading a water-stained newspaper someone had left on the table, though his eyes weren't moving across the words. They were watching the door. Graves dropped into the booth across from them without speaking. The waitress, a tired woman in her 50s with nicotine-stained fingers and the kind of smile that had given up trying to reach her eyes, brought him coffee without being asked. He wrapped his hands around the mug and let the heat seep into his knuckles. Nobody spoke. The Iron Vultures were not a club that filled silence with conversation. They understood that silence was a language of its own, and sometimes it said more than words ever could. The storm pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. Then the diner door burst open. Cold air rushed in hard enough to rattle the napkin dispensers. Every head turned. Every hand stiffened. The instinct was immediate and identical across every biker in the room. A sudden coiling of muscle and attention that came from years of living in a world where an opening door could mean anything. A boy stumbled inside. Small. Thin. Maybe 9 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell because malnutrition and fear had a way of making children look both older and smaller than they actually were. He wore a gray hoodie soaked through with snow and rain, the fabric clinging to his narrow frame like wet paper. No coat, no gloves. Sneakers that were falling apart at the seams, the left sole flapping loose with every step. He carried a black duffel bag clutched against his chest with both arms, holding it the way a drowning person holds a piece of wreckage, desperately, totally, as though letting go meant the end of everything. His eyes were wide and dark, and moving fast across the room, scanning faces, measuring threats, calculating exits. Not the eyes of a child, the eyes of something hunted, something that had been running long enough to forget what stillness felt like. He saw Graves. Something in the boy's expression shifted, not recognition, but decision. The raw animal logic of a creature choosing the biggest predator in the room as its only possible protector. The boy walked straight to the booth and stood there shaking, snow melting off his hoodie and pooling on the floor around his ruined sneakers. His breathing was fast and shallow. His lips were blue. "Don't let him find me," he whispered. His voice cracked on every word. "And whatever happens, don't open the bag." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The coffee machine hissed behind the counter. The wind screamed against the windows. Graves looked at the boy, then at the bag, then back at the boy. He'd seen that look before, not in diners, in war zones, on the faces of children who stood in doorways while the world behind them burned. "Sit down," Graves said quietly. The boy hesitated. His arms tightened around the bag. "Kid, sit down." Noah, though they wouldn't learn his name for another hour, slid into the booth beside Rook, pressing himself against the wall like he was trying to disappear into it. Rook didn't move, didn't speak, just shifted his massive frame slightly to the left, creating a wall of leather and muscle between the boy and the rest of the room. It was an instinct older than language. Protection without permission. The silent geometry of a man who knew what it felt like to be small, in a world built for things that hurt you. Deacon's eyes hadn't left the door. His prosthetic hand rested flat on the table, perfectly still. His real hand was beneath the table, and nobody in the club needed to ask what it was resting on. Outside, through the snow-streaked windows, headlights appeared on the road. 2 sets, moving slowly, then stopping, then going dark. "Graves," Deacon said without turning his head. "I see it." The waitress had frozen behind the counter, her hand still wrapped around the coffee pot, her eyes fixed on the boy. She'd seen things in this diner, truckers with bloody knuckles, women with bruised faces paying for gas station sandwiches with shaking hands, state troopers who looked the other way when certain trucks rolled through at certain hours. But something about this boy, the way he held that bag, the way his eyes kept darting to the windows, the way he was shaking not from cold but from something deeper than cold, made her set the coffee pot down and quietly lock the front door. Nobody asked her to. Nobody thanked her. But Graves met her eyes across the room and gave her a single nod. The minutes passed like hours. The boy wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't release the bag. When Rook tried to drape his cut over the boy's shoulders to stop the shivering, Noah flinched so hard he nearly fell off the bench. The reaction was instantaneous and telling. The full-body recoil of a child who had learned that large hands reaching toward him always meant pain. Rook pulled back slowly. set the cut on the table instead, said nothing. Graves watched. He'd been around enough damaged people, himself included, to read the map of abuse written across the boy's body. The way Noah kept his left arm tucked tight against his ribs, the way he sat with his back pressed flat against the wall, never exposing his spine, the faded yellow bruise along his jawline, half hidden by the hoodie's drawstring, the way his eyes tracked every hand that moved in the room with the precision of someone who had learned to calculate the trajectory of a fist. "What's your name, kid?" "Nothing." "Nobody here's gonna hurt you. That's not what we do." The boy's eyes flicked to the iron vulture's patches, the skulls, the iron crosses, the road-worn leather and scarred knuckles and tattoos that crawled up necks and across hands. He was doing the math, weighing monsters against monsters. "Noah," the boy finally said, barely audible. "My name's Noah Ryder." "Who's looking for you, Noah?" The boy's jaw tightened. His fingers dug into the duffel bag's canvas. "My stepdad. Vernon." "What'd Vernon do to you?" Silence. But the silence was an answer. It was always an answer. Graves leaned forward. His voice dropped low enough that only the boy and the two men beside him could hear. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Not because I'll be angry if you don't, because the truth is the only thing that keeps people alive when things get bad. You understand?" Noah stared at him, then nodded once. "Are you safe at home?" The boy's eyes filled. He didn't cry. It was worse than crying. It was the look of a child who had used up all his tears months ago and now had nothing left but the dry burn of holding everything inside a body too small to contain it. "There is no home," Noah whispered. "There's just Vernon's house, and the trucks." Graves sat back. His jaw worked silently. Beside him, Deacon's knuckles whitened around nothing. Rook closed his eyes and breathed out through his nose, a long, slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of something he'd been holding for a very long time. "The trucks," Graves repeated. "He works for people. They move kids. In the trucks. Through the old logging roads up past Cumberland, they use fake papers, fake names." Noah's voice was flat now, mechanical, the voice of a child reciting facts he'd memorized in order to survive long enough to tell someone. "I took the bag from his office. Everything's in there. The pictures, the phones, the money, everything they need to find the kids." The room had gone completely silent. Even the coffee machine had stopped hissing. 12 men in leather cuts sat in a roadside diner in the middle of a blizzard and listened to a 9-year-old boy describe a child trafficking operation with the clinical precision of someone who had lived inside it. Graves looked at the bag on the booth seat beside Noah. The boy's arms tightened around it reflexively. "I told you not to open it," Noah said. "I heard you. If they get it back, the kids disappear. All of them. Vernon said they'd move everybody across the border before anybody could—" "Noah," Graves held up one hand, not reaching, just stopping. "Nobody's getting that bag." The boy searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for the crack in the promise where the betrayal would eventually seep through, the way it always did. Because every adult in Noah Ryder's life had been a door that opened onto something worse. Outside, the parked vehicles hadn't moved, but now a third set of headlights appeared on the mountain road, crawling through the storm. Then a fourth. "We need to move," Deacon said quietly. Graves stood. The booth creaked. He looked around the diner at his brothers, men who'd ridden through gunfire and grief and freezing rain and the slow erosion of everything the civilian world had promised them and failed to deliver. Men who frightened school boards and small-town sheriffs. Men whose names appeared in law enforcement databases next to words like known associate and person of interest and approach with caution. Men the system had diagnosed, discharged, divorced, discarded. "We're taking the boy to the clubhouse," Graves said. Not a question, not a request. Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. 12 men stood up from their booths in near unison, the sound of boots hitting linoleum and leather creaking filling the diner like something rehearsed. Because it was. They'd done this before. Not this exactly, but something close enough. The geometry of protection. The choreography of men who understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was the only right thing left. Rook lifted Noah onto his shoulders like the boy weighed nothing. Noah tensed, then slowly, carefully, one hand found the collar of Rook's cut and held on. The big man carried him toward the back door while Deacon moved to the front, watching the headlights through the frosted glass. "Take the ridge road," Graves told Deacon. "Keep the lights off till we clear the tree line." "And if they follow?" Graves pulled on his gloves, flexed his fingers inside the cold leather. "Then they follow." The Iron Vulture's clubhouse sat 3 miles up a dirt road carved into the side of Harlan Ridge, buried in old-growth timber and accessible only by a single-lane switchback that turned to mud in rain and ice and snow. It had been a hunting lodge once, back in the 70s, before the family that owned it went bankrupt, and the property sat empty for a decade, rotting in the mountain humidity until the club bought it for back taxes and rebuilt it board by board. The walls were thick, the windows were few. The generator in the basement ran on diesel and stubbornness. They arrived in the dark with their headlights killed, engines rumbling low through the frozen pines. Snow covered everything: the porch, the woodpile, the row of bikes parked beneath the corrugated steel overhang. Inside, the wood stove was cold. Graves knelt and built a fire with the efficiency of a man who'd built 10,000 fires in places where warmth meant survival. The kindling caught. Flames climbed. Orange light crawled across the walls and illuminated the faces of men who looked, in that flickering glow, like something from another century, scarred and weathered and ancient with the kind of knowledge that didn't come from books. Noah sat in the corner farthest from the door, the duffel bag on his lap, his back against the wall. He watched everything with those dark eyes that never stopped moving. When the fire finally threw enough heat to stop the shivering, his shoulders dropped an inch. Just an inch. But Graves noticed. "When's the last time you ate?" Rook asked. "I don't remember." Rook disappeared into the kitchen without another word. Came back 10 minutes later with a plate of scrambled eggs, toast with peanut butter, and a glass of water. He set it on the floor beside Noah. Didn't hand it to him. Didn't stand over him. Just placed it within reach and walked away. Giving the boy space. Giving him the option to come to the food on his own terms, in his own time, without the pressure of being watched. Noah stared at the plate for a long time. Then he ate with one hand, the other still gripping the bag. Graves stood by the window. Through the gap in the curtain, he could see the switchback road below, barely visible through the snow. Nothing moved. Not yet. But his instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through 2 deployments and 15 years of club life, told him the stillness was temporary. Whoever was driving those vehicles at the diner wasn't lost. They weren't seeking shelter. They were tracking. "How'd they know where to find him?" Deacon asked from across the room. He was sitting on the arm of a battered couch, cleaning his prosthetic hand with a rag, a habit he'd picked up years ago, less about maintenance and more about having something to do with his fingers when his mind was working. "Kid ran. They followed. Simple math." 4 trucks ain't simple math. 4 trucks is an operation. Graves turned from the window. "Then it's an operation." "You know what that means?" "Yeah, I know what it means." It meant whoever Noah had stolen that bag from didn't just want it back. They needed it back. The kind of need that justified mobilizing 4 vehicles in a blizzard. The kind of need that meant the contents of that duffel bag weren't just evidence. They were the loose thread that could unravel something much larger than one stepfather beating one kid in one house in one forgotten corner of Appalachia. Around 2 in the morning, Noah began to talk. Not because anyone asked, because the heat and the exhaustion and the strange sensation of being in a room full of large men who hadn't raised a hand against him finally cracked something open inside his chest. He talked the way water moves through a broken dam, slowly at first, then all at once. Vernon Hale married Noah's mother when Noah was 6. She was already drowning, pills, debt, a string of men who treated her like furniture. Vernon seemed better at first. He had money. He had a house outside Harrogate with a garage and a fenced yard and the kinds of things that looked like stability from the outside. But the house had a locked room. The garage had trucks that came and went at strange hours. And Vernon had friends who showed up in the middle of the night and spoke in low voices about routes and schedules and numbers that Noah eventually understood weren't miles or dollars. They were children. "How many?" Graves asked. His voice was very steady, the kind of steady that takes enormous effort. "I don't know. A lot. They come through at night, in the trucks. Vernon's friends take them to different places, hotels, houses, sometimes across the state line. Your mom know? Noah's face went blank. The expression of a child who had learned to feel nothing about the person who was supposed to feel everything for him. She knows. Graves nodded, turned back to the window. The fire popped and sent a shower of sparks against the iron grate. Outside, the wind had shifted direction, driving the snow horizontally through the pines. The mountains were invisible. The world ended at the tree line. Rook had moved to the far side of the room. He stood with his forehead resting against the wall, both fists pressed against the wood paneling, breathing in long, controlled intervals the way they'd taught him at the VA when the anger got too big to hold. He wasn't a man who displayed emotion easily, but the sound of a child describing a trafficking pipeline run by his own stepfather, the casual horror of it, the bureaucratic precision, had landed somewhere inside Rook's chest and detonated with the force of something long buried and never properly diffused. Deacon sat perfectly still on the couch. His prosthetic hand lay on his thigh. His real hand was balled into a fist so tight that the tendons stood out like cables beneath his skin. His eyes were closed, but he was listening to every word, filing it, cataloging it. Because Deacon's gift, his terrible, useful gift, was the ability to remember everything he heard with perfect clarity and replay it later when it was needed most. Graves let the silence hold for a long time after Noah stopped talking. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a man who understood that the next sentence would change the trajectory of everything. We don't open the bag tonight. The boy sleeps. We post watches at the road and the ridge. Nobody rides out until dawn, and when the sun comes up, we figure out exactly what's in that bag and exactly who we're up against. Nobody disagreed. The Iron Vultures had a formal voting process for club decisions, a table, a gavel, a majority rules structure borrowed from 100 years of outlaw motorcycle tradition. But some decisions happened before the vote. Some decisions were made in the silence between a man's question and the room's refusal to object. This was one of those. Noah fell asleep on the floor beside the wood stove, curled around the duffel bag like a child curled around the last possession he had left in the world. Rook draped a wool blanket over him without waking him. Then he sat down in the chair nearest the boy and crossed his arms and stared at the door. He would not move from that chair for the rest of the night. He would not sleep. He would not speak. He would simply sit and watch and wait, a 300-pound wall of scar tissue and silence between a sleeping child and whatever might come through that door. Graves went outside. The cold hit him immediately, not the gradual chill of autumn or the manageable bite of early winter, but the deep structural cold of a mountain blizzard at 2,000 feet, the kind that got into your bones and stayed there and made your teeth ache. He lit a cigarette, stood on the porch and smoked it down to the filter while staring at the road below. Nothing moved, but something was out there. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not with any specific sense, but with all of them at once. The mathematics of threat, the physics of pursuit. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen showed a text from a blocked number. 4 words. Return what was taken. Graves stared at the screen for a long time. The cigarette burned between his fingers. Snow landed on the phone's surface and melted instantly against the glow of the message. He deleted the text, pocketed the phone, finished the cigarette, ground it out beneath his boot heel. Then he went back inside, locked the door, and sat down across from the sleeping boy with a loaded weapon resting on his knee and the certainty, cold, clear, absolute, that whoever had sent that message was not going to wait for an answer. At 3:17 a.m., the first set of headlights appeared on the switchback road below the clubhouse, then the second, then the third. They moved slowly through the snow, their beams cutting pale yellow corridors through the white darkness, climbing the ridge with the deliberate patience of something that already knew exactly where it was going. Deacon was at the window beside Graves. Both men watched without speaking. Behind them, the rest of the club stirred, not with panic, but with the controlled acceleration of men who understood the difference between a drill and the real thing. Boots hit the floor, cuts went on, hands found weapons with the automatic precision of muscle memory. Rook hadn't moved from his chair beside Noah, but his eyes were open and fixed on Graves, waiting for the word. The headlights reached the last switchback, stopped. Engines idled in the darkness, their rumble barely audible above the wind. Then they went dark, all three, simultaneously. As if someone had given a signal. Graves stood slowly. His hand found the grip of the weapon on his knee. His eyes found Deacon's in the firelight. How many you figure? 3 trucks, 4 men per truck minimum. Could be more. Armed? Wouldn't be here if they weren't. Graves looked at Noah, still asleep on the floor, the duffel bag clutched against his chest, the wool blanket rising and falling with each small breath. A 9-year-old boy who had walked into a diner full of strangers and handed them a war. Wake the boy, Graves said. Move him to the basement. Rook goes with him. Nobody gets to that kid. And the rest of us? Graves walked to the door, put his hand on the deadbolt. Outside, the silence was enormous. The kind of silence that exists only in the seconds before violence, when the world holds its breath and waits to see what kind of men will step through the door and what kind of men will be waiting on the other side. The rest of us find out who these people are, Graves said, and we make sure they understand exactly what they walked into. The deadbolt turned. The door opened. Cold air and snow rushed in like the mountain itself was exhaling. And somewhere in the frozen darkness below the tree line, boots crunched through snow, moving uphill, moving closer, moving with the kind of purpose that only came from men who had been sent to retrieve something they could not afford to lose, and had been authorized to do whatever was necessary to get it back. The first gunshot didn't come from the men on the ridge. It came from inside the clubhouse. Deacon fired a single round through the ceiling, a sharp, deliberate crack that froze every man in the room mid-step. Plaster dust drifted down through the firelight like gray snow. The echo died against the log walls. Nobody breathed. Next man who moves toward that door without a plan is going to need somebody to carry him back inside, Deacon said. His voice was flat, clinical. The voice of a man who had spent years behind a scope, calculating wind speed and distance and the precise moment between heartbeats when a trigger pull would send a bullet exactly where it needed to go. He lowered the weapon. His prosthetic hand hung at his side, motionless. His real hand held the pistol with the casual certainty of a man holding a pen. 12 of us, unknown number of hostiles on the ridge, 1 child in the basement, 1 bag of evidence that people are willing to kill for. Anybody want to walk outside and start shooting into a blizzard? Go ahead. But that boy down there doesn't survive chaos. He survives discipline. The room was silent. Graves stood at the open door, cold air pouring past him, snow swirling across the threshold and melting on the floorboards. He hadn't flinched at the shot, hadn't turned. He'd simply stopped, one hand on the door frame, the other holding his weapon at his side, and listened to Deacon the way he always listened to Deacon, with the quiet attention of a man who understood that the smartest person in the room rarely spoke the loudest. He closed the door, turned the deadbolt, faced the room. He's right. A biker named Kane, stocky, mid-40s, shaved head, covered in faded tattoos that crawled from his scalp to his collar, leaned against the kitchen door frame with his arms crossed. He'd been prospecting when Graves first patched in, and he'd ridden with the club through 3 states, 2 funerals, and 1 ATF investigation that went nowhere because nobody talked. He was loyal, he was solid, but he was also the kind of man whose loyalty came with conditions he never articulated until the conditions were breached. "We don't know what's in that bag," Kane said. "The boy told us what's in it." The boy's 9. 9-year-olds say a lot of things. Graves stared at him. "You think he's lying?" "I think we picked up a stray in a snowstorm and now there are trucks on our road and we're sitting in the dark with our guns out. I think before we go to war for a kid we met 3 hours ago, maybe somebody should verify that we're not getting played." The words landed like something dropped on concrete, hard, ugly, honest in the way that honest things are sometimes ugly. Graves didn't respond immediately. He looked around the room at the faces of men he'd ridden beside for years, men he'd bled with, buried brothers with, sat in emergency rooms with, at 4 a.m. while doctors delivered news that changed the shape of their lives. Some of them were watching Kane. Some were watching Graves. All of them were calculating. "Played by who?" Deacon asked quietly. "Could be anybody. Could be a custody thing. Could be a domestic thing. Could be the kid took his stepdad's money and ran and the guy just wants his property back. Could be 1,000 things that don't involve trafficking. The bruises on that kid aren't a custody thing. Bruises mean somebody hit him, doesn't mean the rest of the story's true. The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the windows. From below, through the floorboards, the faint sound of Rook's low voice reached them, talking to Noah. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. Calm, steady. The voice of a man standing between a child and the dark. Graves walked to the center of the room. His boots left wet prints on the wood. His shadow, cast by the fire, moved across the wall behind him like something alive. "I hear you, Kane, and you're not wrong to ask." He paused. His jaw worked. The slow, grinding motion of a man chewing on something harder than words. "But I've been where that kid is. Different details, same math. You're small. You're scared. You tell someone the truth and they find a reason not to believe you because believing you means they have to do something about it. And doing something is expensive. Doing something is dangerous. Doing something means you might lose something you're not willing to lose." He looked at Kane directly. "So you don't do anything. You find a reason the kid's lying. You find a reason the bruises are normal. You find a reason to hand him back to whatever put those bruises there. And you sleep fine because you told yourself a story that made the math work." Kane's jaw tightened. His arms didn't uncross. But something shifted behind his eyes. A crack in the wall he'd built. Too small to see from a distance, but large enough from up close to let something through. "I'm not saying hand him back," Kane said. "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying open the bag." The room contracted around those 4 words. Every man felt it, the gravitational pull of a decision that, once made, could not be unmade. Graves knew it. Deacon knew it. Kane knew it. They all knew it the way soldiers know the difference between the moment before an ambush and the moment inside one. Once you see what's in the bag, you can't unsee it. Once you know, you can't unknow. And once you can't unknow, you either act or you spend the rest of your life pretending you didn't know. "Not yet," Graves said. "Why the hell not?" "Because the boy asked me not to." Kane stared at him, laughed once, short, incredulous, more breath than sound. "We've got a dozen armed men in a freezing clubhouse with hostile vehicles on the road, and you're honoring a promise to a 9-year-old. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Graves, he walked into a room full of men who scare grown adults, and he trusted us enough to ask for one thing. "One thing, Kane." He said don't open it. Maybe that's because what's inside is so bad he doesn't want us to see it until we've already decided to help him. Maybe it's because some adult somewhere already opened something he asked them not to open, and that's when everything went wrong for him. I don't know, but I'm not going to be the next man who breaks a promise to that kid. Kane said nothing. The fire spoke for him, popping, hissing, throwing sparks against the grate. Deacon moved to the window, pulled back the curtain 1/2 inch with his prosthetic finger. The headlights below were still dark. The trucks hadn't moved, but the absence of movement was worse than movement. It meant they were waiting. It meant they had patience. It meant this wasn't a panicked stepfather with a hunting rifle. This was organized, funded, planned. "They're not coming up," Deacon said. "They will. Maybe. But not in this storm, not uphill on black ice on a single-lane switchback with no cover. They'd be sitting ducks on that road, and they know it." "So what are they doing?" Deacon let the curtain fall. "Containing us. Waiting for dawn. Waiting for the snow to stop. Waiting for backup." He paused. "Waiting for us to get tired." Graves pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it. The flame from the lighter cast a brief, sharp light across his face, the deep lines around his mouth, the scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, the eyes that looked 20 years older than the rest of him. He inhaled, exhaled. Smoke curled toward the ceiling and disappeared into the shadows between the rafters. "We need to know who they are," Graves said. "I'll go," said a voice from the corner. Everyone turned. A young biker named Wren stood near the back wall, half hidden in shadow. He was the youngest full patch in the club. 26, lean, quiet, with the kind of face that people forgot 30 seconds after meeting him, which was exactly why he was useful. Wren had been Army intelligence before he washed out after an incident that nobody in the club discussed, because Wren didn't discuss it, and the Iron Vultures respected the borders of silence the same way they respected the borders of territory. He could move through darkness like water through a crack. He could read a license plate from 100 yards in bad light. He could sit in one position for 8 hours without shifting his weight. I'll take the tree line down to the switchback, get plate numbers, see how many we're dealing with, see if they're law or private. And if they see you? Wren almost smiled. It didn't quite reach his mouth. Nobody sees me. Graves looked at Deacon. Deacon gave a single nod, the kind of nod that carried the weight of a complete tactical assessment compressed into a single motion. Go, Graves said. Radio silence, flash your light twice from the tree line when you're back. Wren pulled a black watch cap over his head, zipped his jacket to his throat, and slipped out the back door into the blizzard without a sound. The door closed behind him. Snow blew across the threshold and melted on the floor. Then he was gone, absorbed by the storm as if he'd never been standing there at all. The next 40 minutes were the longest of Graves' life. He sat by the fire with his cigarette burned down to nothing between his fingers. Around him, the club settled into the particular rhythm of waiting that combat veterans understood. The forced stillness, the controlled breathing, the systematic management of adrenaline so that when the moment came, the body could respond without the shaking hands and tunnel vision that panic produced. Some men checked weapons. Some men slept in shifts, boots on, cuts on, lying on the floor with their arms crossed over their chests like men sleeping in coffins. Some men sat and stared at the fire and thought about things they never talked about. The children they'd lost custody of, the wives who'd given up on them, the brothers who'd died on roads or battlefields or in hospital beds surrounded by machines that breathed for them when their lungs finally quit. Graves went down to the basement. The stairs creaked under his weight. The basement was cold and damp and lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a wire. Rook sat on an overturned crate with Noah beside him. The boy was awake, sitting with the bag in his lap, his eyes fixed on a crack in the concrete floor as if the crack contained something only he could see. He won't sleep, Rook said quietly. Graves pulled up another crate and sat across from them. He could hear the boy breathing, quick, shallow, too fast for rest. The breathing of a child whose body hadn't stopped running even though his feet had. Noah, the boy looked up. The men outside. Do you know who they are? Vernon's people. His boss sends them. His boss? Who's the boss? Noah's face changed, not with fear, with something deeper, something that looked like the moment a child realizes that the world he lives in has a structure, and that structure is designed to crush people like him. I don't know his real name. Vernon calls him the broker. He's the one who sets up the routes, who picks which kids go where. He's got people in the police, in the county offices. Vernon says nobody touches the broker because the broker has everybody's secrets. Graves absorbed this without expression, but inside his chest, something shifted. A tectonic movement of understanding that rearranged everything he'd assumed about the situation. This wasn't a local predator running a backyard operation. This was infrastructure. This was a man who had built a system, routes, protocols, protection, and staffed it with people who had too much to lose to ever talk. The cops know, Graves said. Not a question. Some of them. The ones who drive the trucks sometimes. The ones who look the other way at the checkpoints. Which cops, Noah? I don't know names, just faces. Vernon had pictures of them, in the bag. Graves looked at the duffel bag. The boy's fingers were white against the canvas. Kid asked us not to open it, Rook said. I know what he asked. Then we don't open it. Rook, we don't open it, Graves. Not until he says. Rook's voice was quiet, but final. The voice of a man who had drawn a line on the floor and was not going to redraw it. His eyes met Graves's in the dim basement light, and what passed between them was not argument but recognition. Two men who understood that the smallest promises were sometimes the ones that mattered most, because they were the ones that children remembered. Graves nodded, stood, went back upstairs. At 4:41 a.m., two lights flashed in the tree line below the clubhouse. Quick, sharp, then gone. 40 seconds later, Wren slipped through the back door, trailing cold air and snow, his face raw from the wind, his fingers shaking inside his gloves. He moved to the fire without speaking, stood there with his hands extended toward the heat, steam rising from his jacket, ice melting from his eyebrows. He stood like that for 2 full minutes before he spoke. 3 trucks, 2 Chevy Silverados, 1 Ford F-250, all black, no plates on 2 of them, dealer tags on the 3rd from a lot in Middlesbrough. 8 men total, 6 inside the trucks, 2 standing outside the vehicles in the tree cover on the east side of the switchback, both carrying long guns. Not hunting rifles. Tactical. The room was silent. I got close enough to hear them talking. Wren paused. The firelight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones. One of them was on a phone. He called whoever was on the other end deputy, not like a nickname, like a title. Deacon closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were harder. Law enforcement, he said. At least one, maybe more. Could be off-duty, freelancing. Doesn't matter, a badge is a badge. Off-duty or on, if we get into it with these men and one of them turns out to be a working deputy, we're looking at a whole different level of consequence. Graves stood at the window. His back was to the room. His reflection was barely visible in the frost-covered glass, a dark shape against the darker room behind him, outlined in the faint orange glow of the dying fire. So we've got 8 armed men on our road, he said slowly. At least one connected to law enforcement. They're here for the bag. The bag contains evidence of a trafficking ring that involves cops, county officials, and a man nobody can name or touch. The boys stole it. They want it back. And if they get it back, every kid documented in that bag disappears. That about covers it, Deacon said. And if we call the actual law, state police, FBI, whoever, there's a chance the call goes to someone on the broker's payroll and the whole thing gets buried before sunrise. That's a real possibility. Graves turned from the window. His face was unreadable, but his hands were steady, and the steadiness was worse than shaking. It meant he'd passed through the fear and come out the other side into the cold, clear territory where decisions got made and could not be unmade. I need to know what's in that bag. Nobody spoke. But nobody disagreed either. The calculus had changed. 3 hours ago, the bag was a mystery they could afford to leave sealed. Now it was the difference between riding blind and riding with open eyes into something that had teeth and badges and the kind of institutional cover that made evidence disappear and witnesses go quiet. Graves went back down to the basement. Rook was in the same position, seated on the crate, arms crossed, watching the boy. Noah was awake, sitting up, the bag against his chest. Graves knelt in front of him, not standing over, not looking down, kneeling so that his eyes were level with the boy's eyes, which was a choice that cost him nothing physically and everything strategically, because it meant placing himself below the child's line of sight, which meant surrendering the posture of authority that adults instinctively maintained over children, which meant treating this 9-year-old not as a victim to be managed, but as a person to be respected. Noah, I need to talk to you about the bag. The boy's arms tightened. I know what I said, and I meant it, but things have changed. There are men on the road outside with guns and badges. At least one of them is a cop. If we don't know exactly what's in that bag, we can't protect you. We can't protect the other kids, and we can't figure out who to trust. Noah looked at him for a long time. His eyes were dark and ancient with the kind of knowledge no child should carry. In those eyes, Graves saw the arithmetic of betrayal, the running count that every abused child keeps, the ledger of adults who promised and failed, who swore and lied, who said, "Trust me," and then handed him back to the thing that broke him. Every person I gave something to gave it back to Vernon, Noah whispered. My teacher, my neighbor, the woman at the gas station who said she'd call somebody. They all gave it back. I'm not giving anything back. That's what they all said. Graves felt something crack inside his chest. Not dramatically, not with a sound, just a small internal fracture, the kind that happens when a man who has spent years building walls around his own damage comes face to face with a child who has already built walls twice as thick and 10 times as necessary. Noah, look at me. He waited until the boy's eyes settled on his. I am not those people. I am not your teacher. I am not your neighbor. I am not the woman at the gas station. I'm a man with a criminal record and a motorcycle club and a daughter I'm not allowed to see because the court says I'm too broken to be a father. I'm the last person any system would send to help you, and that's exactly why you can trust me, because I've got nothing left to protect except the thing they already took from me. The basement was silent except for the hum of the generator and the distant howl of wind above. Noah Ryder, 9 years old, 80 pounds, bruised ribs, blue lips, carrying a bag that contained the destruction of men far more powerful than him, slowly loosened his grip. His fingers opened one by one, like something unclenching after years of holding on. He pushed the bag across the concrete floor toward Graves. "Don't let them win," the boy said. Graves picked up the bag, unzipped it. The sound of the zipper was obscenely loud in the basement silence. Inside, a manila folder stuffed with photographs. Children, dozens of them. Different ages, different faces, all shot with the flat clinical detachment of documentation rather than memory. Beside the folder, a stack of burner phones held together with a rubber band. 6 in total, each one a node in a communication network designed to be disposable and untraceable. Beneath the phones, a bundle of fake passports with children's photos matched to adult names. Beneath the passports, cash. Banded stacks of hundreds, maybe $15,000 or $20,000 total. And at the bottom of the bag, pressed flat against the canvas, a stuffed rabbit. Small, pink, stained with something dark and dried that had soaked into the fabric and turned it the color of rust. Rook made a sound, low, involuntary. The sound a man makes when something hits him in a place he thought he'd armored years ago. He stood up from the crate and walked to the far wall and pressed both palms flat against the concrete and breathed. Graves held one of the photographs under the bare bulb. A girl, maybe 7. Brown hair. A school picture, the kind with the fake bookshelf background and the forced smile. He'd seen this face before, not in person, on a poster, taped to the window of a gas station on I-40 outside Knoxville months ago, when he'd stopped for fuel and stood at the pump and looked at the poster without really seeing it because he saw 100 of those posters every year, and they'd become wallpaper in a world that produced missing children the way it produced roadkill, constantly, invisibly, with no one willing to look too closely at the source. But Rook had seen it too. Rook, who noticed everything. Rook, who cataloged faces the way other men cataloged engine parts. Rook, who now turned from the wall with his eyes red and his jaw set and his fists hanging at his sides like wrecking balls waiting for a target. "Gracie Dunmore," Rook said. His voice was barely a whisper. "That's her name. 8 years old. Missing since October, out of Cookville. Her grandmother was on the news. Begging." He stopped, swallowed. "Begging somebody to find her." Graves looked at the photograph, then at the bag, then at the basement ceiling, beyond which 12 men sat in a freezing clubhouse surrounded by armed traffickers with law enforcement connections, and in whose midst a 9-year-old boy had just handed them the kind of evidence that could dismantle a network or bury everyone who touched it. He carried the bag upstairs, set it on the table beside the fire, unzipped it, and one by one he laid out the contents while the iron vultures stood in a semicircle and watched without speaking. Nobody looked away. Nobody could. Kane, the man who'd questioned the boy's story an hour earlier, picked up one of the passports, opened it, stared at the photograph of a child paired with the name and date of birth of an adult woman. His hand was shaking. He set it down, picked up another, same thing, and another, same thing. He set the last one down and stepped back from the table and put both hands on his knees and breathed through his mouth like a man trying not to be sick. "I was wrong," Kanye said. He didn't look up. "Tell the kid I was wrong." Graves placed the photographs in a row on the table. 14 faces, 14 children, some smiling for school cameras, some caught in candid shots, walking, playing, standing in doorways, unaware that someone had already marked them. Each photograph had a number written in pencil on the back. Route codes, delivery schedules, a language of logistics applied to human beings who still believed in birthday cakes and bedtime stories. Deacon picked up one of the burner phones, powered it on. The screen glowed in the dark room. He scrolled through text messages with his thumb, his face expressionless, his prosthetic hand holding the phone steady. Dates, times, pickup locations, drop-off points, names, probably aliases, but patterns we can trace. He looked up. This is enough. If this gets to the right people, this is enough to break the whole thing open. "If it gets to the right people," Graves repeated. "That's the problem. We don't know who the right people are. The kid says cops are in on it. County officials. The man running the operation has leverage on people in every agency that could investigate it. Federal. It has to go federal. You got a Fed you trust? Deacon didn't answer. Nobody did. Because trust, in the world these men inhabited, was a currency that had been devalued by decades of experience, by informants who turned out to be agents, by deals that turned out to be traps, by the systematic education that came from living on the wrong side of every institution that was supposed to protect you. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was colder now, the chill creeping in from the walls and the floor and the windows that rattled in their frames against the wind. Outside, the storm was showing the first signs of exhaustion. The snow still falling, but lighter now. The wind still blowing, but without the violent gusts that had driven it horizontally through the trees. Dawn was coming, and with it, the end of the only advantage they had. The storm had kept the men on the road at bay. The darkness had hidden the clubhouse's vulnerabilities, but daylight would expose everything. The single access road, the lack of cover, the 12 bikes parked under the overhang that might as well have been a neon sign reading, "We're still here." Graves stood at the table, looking down at 14 photographs of missing children, and felt the full weight of the decision settling onto his shoulders like something physical. If he called the police, he might be calling the very people who ran the trucks. If he tried to move Noah and the evidence off the mountain, he'd have to go through 8 armed men on a single road. If he did nothing, if he waited and hoped, the men below would not wait forever, and their patience would end with violence. He looked around the room at his brothers, scarred, exhausted, underfed, and sleep-deprived and frozen halfway through and holding weapons in hands that had been broken and healed and broken again. Not one of them had asked to leave. Not one of them had suggested giving back the bag. Not one of them had done the sensible, survivable thing and calculated the cost-benefit analysis of risking everything for a child they'd met 6 hours ago. Because the math didn't work that way. Not for these men. Not for men who had been abandoned by every institution that was supposed to catch them when they fell. The military that used them and discarded them, the VA that diagnosed them and forgot them, the courts that judged them and erased them, the families that loved them and then couldn't live with them anymore. These were men who understood, in the deepest and most personal way, what it felt like to be a human being that the system decided wasn't worth saving. And they were looking at 14 photographs of children the system had decided the same thing about. "We don't call the cops," Graves said. "We don't run. We don't hide. We take this evidence, we take this boy, and we write it straight into the hands of somebody who can burn this whole network to the ground. And if anybody tries to stop us between here and there, badge or no badge, guns or no guns, they find out what happens when they step between the iron vultures and a kid who asked us not to let him down." Deacon nodded slowly. Kane exhaled and straightened up. Wren, still steaming by the fire, checked his weapon without being asked. Around the room the club moved, not with urgency but with purpose. The quiet, deliberate movements of men who had crossed a line and knew there was no crossing back. And at that moment, that exact moment, as if the universe had been listening, Noah's voice rose from the basement stairwell, small, trembling, cracked with the kind of fear that lives in the chest and not the throat. "Graves?" "Yeah, kid." "The broker, I said I didn't know his name." A pause, breathing, the sound of a child gathering the last ounce of courage he had left. "I lied. I know his name. I didn't tell you because—" Another pause, longer, heavier. "Because his last name is Mercer, same as yours. Vernon told me the broker is your brother." The room stopped. The fire stopped. The wind stopped. Everything stopped except the sound of Graves's breathing, slow, deep, controlled. The breathing of a man who has just been shot, but hasn't looked down yet to see where the bullet went in. 14 photographs stared up from the table. A 9-year-old boy stood at the top of the basement stairs. And Del Graves Mercer stood in the center of a room full of men who were now looking at him with something that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Doubt. Nobody moved for 11 seconds. Graves counted them the way he'd been trained to count, automatically, involuntarily, the way a body counts heartbeats or breaths, or the distance between a muzzle flash and the sound that follows it. 11 seconds of absolute silence in which every man in the room recalculated everything they thought they knew about the man standing in front of them. Then Kane spoke. "Brother?" One word. dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Not a question, not an accusation, just the word itself, stripped bare, hanging in the cold air between the dying fire and the 14 photographs on the table. Graves didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall, beyond the storm, beyond the mountain itself. A point that existed only in the private geography of a man who had just heard his own last name attached to something he could not yet process. His hands hung at his sides. His cigarette had gone out between his fingers. The ash fell to the floor without a sound. "Graves," Deacon said, carefully, "the way you say a name to someone standing on a ledge. Talk to us." "I don't have a brother." The words came out flat, mechanical. The voice of a man reciting a fact he'd rehearsed so many times it had lost all connection to the truth it was supposed to contain. "Kid says different," Kane said. Graves turned his head slowly toward the basement stairs. Noah stood at the top, one hand gripping the doorframe, his small body half hidden behind the wall as though he'd already calculated the trajectory of the anger in the room and positioned himself at the edge of its blast radius. Rook stood behind him, a shadow made of muscle and leather and the quiet fury of a man who had watched a child deliver a grenade and was now waiting to see who it would destroy. "Say it again," Graves said to Noah. His voice was very controlled, the kind of controlled that required enormous effort to maintain, like holding a door shut against a flood with nothing but your shoulder and the knowledge that if the door opened, everything behind it would drown. "Vernon told me. He said the broker's name is Eli Mercer. He said Eli set up the whole network, the routes, the contacts, the money." Noah paused. His fingers tightened on the doorframe until the knuckles went white. "He said Eli was your older brother. He said you knew." The last three words detonated in the room like a flashbang. White noise. Ringing silence. Every pair of eyes in the clubhouse swung to Graves with the synchronized precision of gun turrets tracking a target. "He said you knew," Kane repeated slowly. "He said you knew, Graves." Graves's jaw clenched. The muscles along the side of his face contracted and released in a rhythm that looked like chewing, the involuntary grinding of a man whose body was processing something his mind hadn't finished receiving. He looked at Noah. Looked through Noah. Looked at the shape of a 9-year-old boy who had just set fire to the only structure Graves had left, the trust of the men who rode beside him. "I have not spoken to Eli Mercer in 17 years. His voice was raw, stripped of the measured steadiness he normally wore like armor. "He is not my brother. He is a man who shares my blood and nothing else. The last time I saw him was in a parking lot outside our mother's funeral, and the last thing he said to me was that I was a waste of a uniform and a waste of a name. I got on my bike. I rode south. I never looked back. I didn't know what he became. I didn't know about the routes. I didn't know about the children. I didn't know." The fire popped. A log shifted in the grate. Embers spiraled upward and died against the cold air. "But Vernon told the kid you did," Kane said. "Vernon is a man who beats a 9-year-old and moves children in trucks. You want to take his word over mine?" "I don't know whose word to take right now, Graves. That's the problem." Deacon stepped between them. Not physically, he was still 6 feet away, but with his voice, which carried the kind of authority that didn't require volume. "Everybody stop. Right now. Stop and think." He looked at Kane, then at Graves, then at the room. "If this is true, if the broker is Graves's brother, that changes the tactical picture. It doesn't change who Graves is. We've ridden with this man for years. We've seen what he does. We know who he is. One name from a terrified kid repeating what a child trafficker told him doesn't erase that." "It doesn't erase it," Caney said, "but it puts a crack in it, and cracks are where things come apart." Graves walked to the table, stood over the photographs. His hands were on the surface, fingers spread, weight pressing down through his arms as though he was trying to hold the table to the floor or hold himself to the earth. He stared at the faces of the children and breathed. "Eli was always the smart one," he said quietly. "Not to anyone. To the room, to the walls, to the dead air between the logs. Straight A's, business scholarship at Tennessee State. Mom used to say he'd be the one who made something of the family name. She didn't know what kind of something." He paused, closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Not crying, just wet, the way metal gets wet before it rusts. I joined the Marines because I wasn't good enough for college. He went to school because he was too smart for war. We stopped talking after I got back from my first deployment because I came home broken, and he came home successful, and neither of us could stand looking at the other because we each reminded the other of the life we didn't choose. When did he go dark? Deacon asked. I don't know. I stopped keeping track. Last I heard, 10, 12 years ago, he was running some kind of logistics company out of Knoxville. Freight consulting, supply chain management. Graves laughed once, a short, vicious sound with no humor in it. Supply chain, that's what they call it when you move human beings from one location to another and charge money for the delivery. Noah was still standing at the top of the stairs. Rook's hand rested on the boy's shoulder, not gripping, just present. An anchor. Noah, Deacon said, what else did Vernon tell you about Eli? The boy looked at Graves before answering. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a species of recognition. The mutual acknowledgement of two people who had both been damaged by forces connected to the same bloodline. Vernon said Eli has a house outside Jellicoe. Big house. Gated. He said Eli keeps the main records there. The real records. Not the copies in the bag. The originals. Names of the buyers. The roots going back years. The payments. Everything. Noah swallowed. He said Eli has protection. Not just cops. Federal people. People who owe him because he has files on them. Things they did. Things they paid for. The room absorbed this information the way dry ground absorbs water. Slowly, completely. And with the understanding that what had been absorbed would change the composition of everything it touched. Blackmail, Deacon said. Insurance, Graves corrected. That's how Eli would think about it. Not leverage. Insurance. You don't threaten people with what you know. You just make sure they know that you know. And then nobody touches you because touching you means everybody falls. A mutual destruction pact, Wren said from the corner. He'd been quiet since returning from his reconnaissance, standing near the fire with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. But his mind was working, processing, connecting, building the intelligence picture the way he'd been trained. He doesn't need muscle. He doesn't need to be violent. He just needs to be the filing cabinet that nobody can afford to open. Exactly. So the men on the road are expendable. Contractors. Vernon's people, not Eli's. Eli doesn't send his own. He sends people who can be denied, replaced, discarded. If they get caught, there's nothing connecting them to him. If they succeed, the bag comes back and the system goes on. Deacon pulled one of the burner phones from the table, scrolled through the messages again, this time reading with new eyes. Not for content, but for pattern. These phones. The messages go through a relay. Number forwards to number forwards to number. But there's a pattern. Every third message routes through the same prefix, Knoxville area code. Eli's relay. Most likely. Graves straightened. The wetness in his eyes had dried. Something had replaced it. Something cold and bright and absolute, like the light that fills a room when you open a door that's been sealed for years and discover that the room behind it contains exactly what you were afraid it would contain. I need air, he said. He walked out the front door, didn't grab his cut, didn't grab a weapon, just walked through the door into the pre-dawn darkness and stood on the porch in the freezing wind with his face turned up to the sky and his arms at his sides and the snow falling on him like it was trying to bury him standing up. Deacon followed, stood beside him. Neither man looked at the other. They looked at the ridge and the tree line and the faint shapes of the trucks below, which were now visible as darker rectangles against the gray-white landscape as the first thin light of dawn began to bleed through the storm clouds to the east. I didn't know, Graves said. I believe you. Does everyone? Deacon was quiet for a moment. Kane's scared. Scared men ask hard questions. Doesn't mean they've made up their minds. If they don't trust me, this falls apart. We can't ride into this divided. Then give them something to ride toward. Not your word. Something bigger. Graves looked at him. Like what? Like Eli. Deacon's voice dropped. You know where Jellicoe is. You know how your brother thinks. You're the only person in this club, maybe the only person alive, who can walk through that man's front door without him seeing you as a threat, because you're family, and family is the one blind spot a man like that can't protect against. Graves stared into the darkness. The idea sat in his chest like a swallowed blade, sharp, impossible to ignore, painful in every direction. You want me to use my own blood to bring him down. I want you to use the only weapon you have that nobody else does. The wind cut across the porch and drove ice crystals into their faces. Below, one of the truck engines turned over, a low, guttural sound that carried up the mountainside and settled in the chest like a warning. They're warming up, Deacon said. Dawn's coming. Storm's breaking. We don't have much time. Graves finished his cigarette, crushed it under his boot. The ember died in the snow with a faint hiss. Get everyone upstairs. I need the table. Inside, the club gathered. Rook brought Noah up from the basement, and the boy sat on the floor near the stove with the wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching with the alert stillness of a child who had learned that the important things in life were decided in rooms where nobody asked for his opinion. Graves spread the contents of the bag across the table, the photographs, the phones, the passports, the cash. Then he reached into the bag one more time and pulled out the last item, the stuffed rabbit. Small, pink, stained with dried blood that had soaked into the fur and turned it the color of something dead. He set it in the center of the table, under the light, where everyone could see it. This belonged to one of the children, Graves said. I don't know which one. I don't know if she's still alive, but I know that somebody loved this thing enough to hold on to it while they were being loaded into a truck and moved like cargo to a place where nobody could hear them scream. The room was so silent that the ticking of the wood stove sounded like a metronome marking the passage of something that couldn't be measured in minutes. The man who built the network that did this to her is named Eli Mercer. He's my older brother. I haven't seen him in 17 years. I didn't know what he'd become. Some of you believe that. Some of you don't. I'm not going to stand here and try to convince you because I've spent my whole life in rooms where men talk their way out of accountability, and I'm not going to add my voice to that tradition. He looked around the table, made eye contact with each man individually, held it. Let them see whatever they needed to see, the guilt, the fury, the shame, the determination, the raw exposed nerve of a man who had just discovered that his own blood ran through the veins of a monster. Here's what I know. Eli has a house outside Jellicoe. That house contains the records that can dismantle the entire network. Not copies, originals, names, dates, transactions, photographs, blackmail files on every official and officer he owns. If we get those records and put them in the right hands, every child in those photographs has a chance of being found. Every person in that network has a chance of being prosecuted. And every truck that rolls through those mountain roads carrying children instead of freight has a chance of being stopped. He put both hands flat on the table. I'm going to Jellicoe. I'm going to walk into my brother's house. I'm going to get those records. And if he tries to stop me, I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make sure he doesn't succeed. I'm asking you to ride with me, but I'm not ordering it. This isn't a club vote. This is a choice. Every man makes it for himself. Silence. The fire crackled. Wind pushed against the walls. Kane stepped forward. His face was hard. His eyes were harder. But when he spoke, his voice carried something unexpected. Not hostility, not suspicion, but the raw, grudging respect of a man who had tested another man's foundation and found it solid. I was wrong about the kid. I'm not going to be wrong about you. He extended his hand. I'm riding. Graves took it. Their grip held for 3 seconds, long enough to mean something, short enough to avoid sentiment. Rook didn't speak. He simply walked to the door and pulled his cut off the hook and put it on. Which was his answer. Which was always his answer. One by one, the others followed. Deacon, Wren, 9 more men whose names were written in no history book, and whose faces appeared in no newspaper, and whose contributions to the world would never be measured by the institutions that had discarded them. They stood up. They put on their cuts. They checked their weapons. And they waited. The men on the road, Deacon said. We've still got to get past them. Graves looked at Wren. You said 2 on foot, 6 in trucks. That was 2 hours ago. Could be different now. The switchback is the only road down. If we ride it, We're in a single file on a narrow lane with no cover. They'll pick us apart. Deacon unfolded a creased topographic map that had been pinned to the wall behind the bar for as long as anyone could remember. He spread it on the table over the photographs, his prosthetic finger tracing the contour lines with mechanical precision. There's a logging trail, here. His finger stopped on a hairline track that branched off the main ridge and descended the northern face of the mountain through dense timber before connecting to a gravel Forest Service road 3 miles below. It hasn't been maintained in years, probably washed out in places. Definitely iced over. But it bypasses the switchback entirely and comes out on Route 63 south of the Gap. In this weather? On Harleys? Nobody said it was a good plan. I said it was a plan. Graves studied the map. The logging trail was a thread, barely visible, barely navigable, the kind of path that would challenge a dirt bike in summer and would destroy a fully loaded Harley in a winter storm. Rocks, ice, fallen timber, switchbacks that hadn't been graded in a decade. One mistake and a bike would go over the edge of the mountain and land 300 feet below in a ravine that nobody would search for weeks. But the main road had 8 armed men on it, and armed men in trucks were worse than ice on a logging trail. We go at first light, Graves said. Single file. Slow. Rook takes the boy on his bike. Wren rides point. Deacon rides rear. Nobody stops, nobody turns back, and if anybody goes down, the man behind him picks up the rider and keeps moving. And the bag? I carry it. If something happens to me, it goes to Deacon. If something happens to Deacon, it goes to Kane. The chain doesn't break. The plan was simple because simple plans were the only ones that survived contact with reality. Graves had learned that in Fallujah, where elaborate operations fell apart in the first 30 seconds, and the only thing that kept men alive was the ability to reduce complexity to its smallest functional unit. Move, cover, survive, repeat. Dawn came slowly, not the dramatic sunrise of postcards and photographs, but the grudging gray light of a mountain morning after a blizzard, thin, flat, filtered through a sky that looked like wet concrete. The snow had slowed to scattered flurries. The wind had dropped. The world outside the clubhouse emerged in shades of gray and white and the dark green of frozen pines, beautiful and merciless in the way that only high country in winter could be. Graves went to Noah one last time before they mounted up. The boy stood in the main room with his blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, his eyes moving from biker to biker as they prepared to ride, checking weapons, tightening boots, zipping cuts, pulling gloves over scarred and swollen hands. You're going to ride with Rook. Hold on tight. Don't let go for any reason. Where are we going? Graves hesitated. The truth was heavy, but lies were heavier. They accumulated weight over time, and this boy had been carrying lies his entire life. We're going to find your stepfather's boss. We're going to take everything he has, and we're going to give it to people who can stop him. The boss is your brother. Yeah. Are you scared? Graves looked at the boy, looked at the dark eyes that held too much knowledge for their age, looked at the thin shoulders and the bruised ribs and the hands that still trembled even in the warmth of the stove. Yeah, kid, I'm scared. Noah nodded, as if this was the right answer, as if honesty about fear was the only currency he still accepted from adults. Good, Noah said. Vernon was never scared. He said scared was for weak people. But the people who hurt me were never scared of anything. The people who helped me always were. Graves didn't respond. There was nothing to say to a 9-year-old philosopher whose education had been conducted in the classrooms of violence and neglect. He simply put his hand on the boy's head, briefly, carefully, the way you touch something fragile that has already been broken and repaired so many times that the repairs have become part of its structure. The bikes fired one by one in the gray light, 12 engines coughing to life in the frozen air, exhaust plumes rising white against the dark pines, the sound rolling across the mountain like distant thunder. Rook lifted Noah onto the back of his Harley and showed him where to hold, hands locked around the big man's waist, feet braced on the passenger pegs, chin tucked against the wind. The boy gripped the leather and didn't flinch. Somewhere between the diner and this moment, he'd made a decision about these men that overrode every lesson his life had taught him about trusting strangers. Wren led them off the main track and onto the logging trail. The transition was immediate and violent. from gravel to frozen dirt to ice-covered rock in the space of 50 feet. The bikes lurched and slid and fought for traction while the riders muscled them through ruts and over fallen branches, their bodies absorbing the punishment through their knees and their spines and their wrists. The trail was barely 6 feet wide in places, with a mountain wall on one side and a vertical drop on the other, and the frozen mud beneath the tires offered the kind of grip that existed mostly as a negotiation between the rider's skill and gravity's patience. They descended for 20 minutes before Deacon's voice crackled through the radio, a single word, clipped, urgent. "Contact." Graves looked back. Through the trees, on the ridge above and behind them, two figures moved along the logging trail they'd just been on foot, moving fast. They'd found the tracks in the snow, 12 sets of tire marks leading off the main road onto the logging trail, and they were following. "They're tracking us," Wren said through the radio. "How far back?" "Quarter mile. Maybe less. They'll radio the trucks. The trucks can loop around to 63 and cut us off at the bottom." Graves did the math. 3 miles of logging trail remaining. 8 minutes at their current speed. If the trucks moved now, if the men on the ridge had already called, they could reach the intersection of the forest road and Route 63 in roughly the same amount of time. It would be close. It would be a race measured in seconds and decided by ice and engine power, and the willingness of 12 men on motorcycles to push machines designed for asphalt through terrain that would challenge a four-wheel drive. "Faster," Graves said into the radio. "Don't stop for anything." The bikes accelerated, the trail blurred beneath them, rocks and ice and frozen mud and the occasional flash of open air where the trail skirted the edge of the mountain and the drop fell away into white nothing. Noah pressed his face against Rook's back and held on with the desperate strength of a child who understood that the distance between survival and disaster was measured in the grip of his fingers. They hit the Forest Service road at the bottom of the mountain, doing 40 on frozen gravel. The road was wider here, 2 lanes, rutted, bordered by snow-covered ditches and the skeletal remains of summer undergrowth. Wren opened up the throttle and the convoy stretched out, engines screaming against the cold air, exhaust trails streaming behind them, like the tails of comets. Route 63 appeared ahead. The intersection. A stop sign buried in snow. And beyond it, the gray ribbon of highway stretching south toward Cumberland Gap and Harrogate and the Tennessee border, and a house outside Jellicoe, where a man named Eli Mercer kept the records that could burn a trafficking empire to ash. Graves reached the intersection first, stopped, looked left, toward the mountain. Headlights. 2 sets. Moving fast. Less than a mile away and closing. He looked right. Open road. Clear. South. "Go," he said into the radio. "Go now. Don't stop until Jellicoe." The bikes roared through the intersection one after another. Wren, then 4 brothers, then Rook with Noah pressed against his back, then Kane, then 3 more, then Deacon running rear guard with his eyes on the mirrors and his hand steady on the throttle. 12 bikes in a ragged line burning south on Route 63, while behind them 2 black trucks reached the intersection and turned to follow, their engines roaring as they accelerated, closing the distance with the mechanical patience of machines that didn't tire and didn't feel cold and didn't care about the lives they were chasing. The chase lasted 11 miles. The trucks were faster on the straightaways, but the bikes were faster in the curves, leaning into the frozen turns with the kind of reckless precision that came from years of riding mountain roads in conditions that would have killed recreational riders in the first half mile. They rode in formation, tight, coordinated, communicating through radio bursts and hand signals and the instinctive choreography of men who had ridden together long enough to think like a single organism. At mile 8, Deacon's voice came through the radio, calm, almost bored. "They're backing off." Graves checked his mirrors. The trucks had slowed, fallen back. Their headlights shrank in the gray distance until they were just points of light, stationary, watching. "They're not chasing," Graves said. "No, they're reporting. To Eli. Has to be. They know we're heading south. They know we have the bag. And now they know we're not running. We're going somewhere specific, which means Eli will know we're coming before we get there." The convoy slowed. The engines dropped from screaming to growling. 12 bikes rolled south through the Appalachian morning, while the mountains rose around them like walls, and the sky pressed down like a ceiling, and the road unwound ahead of them toward a destination that was no longer a surprise for anyone on either side of this war. Graves rode at the front. The wind cut through his jacket and numbed his face and turned his knuckles white inside his gloves. He could feel the duffel bag strapped to the back of his bike. The weight of it, the terrible gravity of evidence that named his own blood as the architect of something unspeakable. And beneath the physical sensation, a deeper weight. The weight of knowing that the man he was riding toward shared his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and the last name that had been stitched onto the back of a military uniform 20 years ago in a recruiting office in Knoxville by a woman who told him the name would make his family proud. The name Mercer. Carried into 2 wars by one brother. Carried into the trafficking of children by the other. The same name. The same blood. 2 different kinds of destruction. 20 miles from Jellicoe, Graves pulled the convoy into an abandoned gas station, the kind of place that exists in the margins of Appalachian highways, like a forgotten sentence in a story nobody finished. Rusted pumps, broken windows, a canopy sagging under the weight of snow and neglect. They killed the engines and stood in the parking lot and breathed, and nobody spoke for a long time, because speaking meant acknowledging what came next. Graves's phone vibrated. He pulled it out, looked at the screen. A text. From a number he hadn't seen in 17 years but recognized immediately. The way you recognize a voice from childhood, the way you recognize the sound of a door that always opened onto something terrible. 3 words. Come home, brother. And beneath the text, a photograph. A girl. Brown hair. School picture with the fake bookshelf background. The same photograph from the duffel bag. Gracie Dunmore. 8 years old, missing since October. But in this version of the photograph, the girl wasn't smiling for a school camera. She was sitting in a room, on a bed, looking at whoever held the camera with the flat, dead eyes of a child who had stopped expecting rescue. The photograph was time-stamped. This morning, 47 minutes ago. She was alive. She was in that house. And the man who put her there was inviting his brother to come and see what he'd built. Graves stared at the screen until the image blurred. Then he looked up at his brothers, 12 men standing in the ruins of an abandoned gas station on a frozen highway in the mountains of Tennessee, waiting for him to say the words that would carry them into the worst thing any of them had ever ridden toward. She's alive, Graves said. She's in the house. He wants us to come. Rook stepped forward. His face was granite. His hands were fists. Then we go. It's a trap. I know. He'll have men. He'll have leverage. He'll have everything prepared. I know. Rook. That little girl is sitting in a room waiting for somebody to open the door, Graves. I don't care what's on the other side of it. Graves looked at his brothers. One by one, they mounted their bikes. One by one, the engines fired. One by one, they pulled back onto the highway and pointed their machines south toward Jellicoe, toward a gated house on a hill where a man who shared Graves's blood and none of his humanity sat waiting with a child in a locked room and the confidence of someone who had never once been confronted by something he couldn't buy, blackmail, or bury. And behind them, Noah Ryder, still gripping Rook's waist, still pressing his face against leather that smelled like engine oil and cold wind, and the particular scent of men who had decided to stop running, whispered something into the roar of the engines that nobody heard but the mountain itself. Don't let them win. The bikes leaned into the curve. The road bent south. The sky was the color of iron. And somewhere ahead, in a house that sat behind a gate on a hill above the fog line, a phone rang, and a man who looked like Graves but carried none of his damage and all of his intelligence answered it and smiled. Because the only thing more useful than a brother you could control was a brother who believed he was coming to stop you, when in fact he was delivering exactly what you needed to finish what you'd started. The gate was open. That was the first thing Graves noticed when the convoy crested the hill outside Jellicoe, and the house appeared through the fog like something surfacing from deep water. A wrought iron gate, 12 feet tall, set between stone pillars topped with security cameras, and it stood wide open, both halves pulled back against the driveway walls as if someone had rolled out a welcome mat made of steel in surveillance. Graves killed his engine 50 yards from the entrance. The other bikes stopped behind him in a staggered line, engines idling, exhaust plumes rising into the gray morning air. The house sat at the top of a long gravel drive that curved through bare oaks and frozen landscaping, a sprawling stone and timber structure that looked like it had been designed by someone who wanted to project the image of old money without the inconvenience of actually having inherited it. 3 stories, a wraparound porch, a detached garage large enough to hold 6 vehicles, floodlights mounted at every corner, all of them on despite the daylight, casting flat white light across the property with the indiscriminate brightness of a prison yard. "Open gate," Deacon said through the radio. "That's an invitation." "Or a mouth," Connie said. Graves sat on his bike and studied the property. 2 vehicles were parked in front of the garage, a black Escalade and a silver Mercedes sedan. No movement, no figures in the windows, no sound except the wind moving through the bare trees and the low rumble of 12 idling Harleys. "Wren, what do you see?" Wren had pulled off the road 100 yards back and was studying the property through a compact set of binoculars he'd carried in his saddlebag since his intelligence days. His voice came through the radio with the clinical detachment of a man reading a topographic map. 2 cameras on the gate pillars, 2 more on the porch corners, 1 on the garage roof. That one's a PTZ, it's tracking. Motion sensor lights on the east and west flanks. No visible personnel outside. Curtains drawn on all first-floor windows except the front-facing study, left side of the house, ground floor. Lights on in there. I can see a desk. Chairs occupied. "He's sitting at his desk," Graves said. "Waiting for you." Graves looked back at Rook. Noah was still pressed against the big man's back, his face hidden inside the collar of a jacket 3 sizes too large that someone had given him during the ride. The boy hadn't spoken since the gas station. He'd retreated into the survival silence that children learn when the world around them becomes too loud and too dangerous for words. "Noah stays here," Graves said. "Rook stays with him. Kane, take 2 men and cover the rear of the property. Don't let anybody leave through the back. Wren, find high ground with eyes on the front and the east flank. Deacon comes with me." "Just Deacon?" Kane asked. "This is my brother's house. He invited me. If I walk in with 12 men, he'll treat it as an assault, and whatever he's got waiting inside goes loud before we see it. 2 men walking through the front door is a conversation. A conversation is what we need, long enough to find the girl, find the records, and figure out who else is in there. And if the conversation goes sideways?" Graves looked at Kane. "Then you hear gunfire, and you stop covering the back and start coming through it." The plan was thin. Graves knew it. Deacon knew it. Everyone knew it. But thin plans were the only kind that existed when you were riding into something designed by someone smarter than you who had home field advantage and 17 years of preparation. The only edge Graves had was the one thing Eli couldn't calculate, the variable of a brother who wasn't coming for leverage or negotiation or any of the transactional motivations that Eli's world ran on. Graves was coming because a girl named Gracie Dunmore was sitting in a room in that house, and the stuffed rabbit that belonged to her was stained with blood, and the photograph of her dead eyes was burned into his memory like a brand. They moved. Kane and 2 brothers peeled off and circled wide, disappearing into the tree line on the west side of the property. Wren dismounted and vanished uphill with the binoculars and a rifle he'd pulled from a hard case strapped to his bike, the practiced disappearance of a man whose greatest skill was becoming invisible. Rook pulled his Harley behind a stand of pines 50 yards from the gate, positioning himself and Noah behind cover with clear sight lines to the driveway and the road. The remaining brothers spread into a loose perimeter, engines off, weapons accessible, positioned at intervals along the tree line like sentinels. Graves and Deacon walked through the open gate side by side. Their boots crunched on frozen gravel. The security camera on the right pillar tracked their movement with the slow mechanical precision of a predator conserving energy. The driveway was long, maybe 200 yards, and they covered it in silence, 2 men in leather cuts and road-worn boots walking toward a stone house in the fog like gunslingers approaching a saloon in a film that nobody had written a happy ending for. The front door was unlocked. Graves pushed it open. The foyer was wide and tiled in dark stone, with a staircase rising to the second floor and hallways branching left and right. The air smelled like coffee and furniture polish, and something underneath both, something chemical, something that reminded Graves of the institutional smell of government buildings and hospital corridors, The smell of places where important things were stored and ordinary people were not welcome. Left, Deacon murmured. The study. They turned left. The hallway was lined with framed photographs. Not family pictures, but aerial shots of properties, highway interchanges, warehouse complexes. The visual resume of a logistics empire. At the end of the hallway, a door stood open. Light spilled across the hardwood floor. Graves stopped at the threshold, looked inside. Eli Mercer sat behind a mahogany desk in a leather chair with his hands folded on the surface in front of him. He was 53 years old, 6 feet tall, lean in the way that expensive personal trainers and controlled diets produced, with silver gray hair combed back from a forehead that had the same shape as Graves's, but none of the scars. He wore a charcoal sweater over a collared shirt. No rings, no watch, no visible anything that suggested the life documented in the duffel bag strapped to Graves's back. He looked like a college dean. He looked like somebody's accountant. He looked like the kind of man who served on community boards and donated to scholarship funds and shook hands at charity dinners, while the other hand signed transport orders for children who would never see another charity dinner or scholarship fund or community board for the rest of their lives. He looked up when Graves appeared in the doorway, and he smiled. Dell? The name landed like a slap. Nobody called him Dell. Nobody had called him Dell since their mother died. The name belonged to a version of himself that had been buried so deep beneath the scar tissue of war and divorce and club life that hearing it spoken aloud, in that voice, in that house, by that man, felt like having a grave dug up. Eli, you look tired. You look comfortable. Eli's smile didn't waver. His eyes moved to Deacon, standing slightly behind and to the right of Graves, and the smile adjusted, became something cooler, more evaluative, the smile of a man measuring a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. Your friend can wait in the hall. My friend stays where he is. Suit yourself. Eli gestured to the chairs opposite his desk. Sit. I'll stand. Still doing that. The standing thing. You always did that. Stood in doorways, stood at the edges of rooms. Mom used to say you were always ready to leave because you never believed you were welcome. Don't talk about her. The words came out with an edge that surprised even Graves. A blade of something ancient and unresolved, the compressed fury of a man who had spent 17 years not thinking about the person sitting in front of him, and was now discovering that the not thinking had been a dam, and the dam was cracking. Eli raised both hands slightly, a gesture of concession that managed to look like a gesture of control. Fair enough. Let's talk about why you're here. Where's the girl? Which girl? Graves pulled the photograph from his jacket, the one Eli had texted him. Gracie Dunmore. Dead eyes, locked room. Time-stamped 47 minutes before they'd arrived at the gas station. He placed it on the desk. Eli looked at it. His expression didn't change, not a flicker, not a twitch. The face of a man who had looked at photographs like this so many times that the images had stopped being children and started being inventory. She's upstairs, she's fine. Define fine however you want. She's breathing, she's fed, she's physically unharmed. I'm not a monster, Dell. I'm a businessman. Deacon made a sound, low, involuntary, something between a breath and a growl. His prosthetic hand tightened at his side with an audible click of the mechanical joints. A businessman, Graves repeated. Supply and demand. That's all anything is. I didn't create the demand. I identified it. I built infrastructure to serve it. I employed people, created systems, established protocols. What I do is no different from what any logistics company does. I move product from point A to point B based on client specifications. Product. You want to have a moral conversation, Dell? You? A man who's committed assault, intimidation, and conspiracy as a lifestyle for 15 years? A man whose club has been investigated by 3 federal agencies? You want to sit in my study and judge me? I've never moved a child. No. You've just broken enough laws to fill a file cabinet. The difference between us isn't moral, it's scale. Graves stepped forward. Deacon stepped with him. Eli didn't flinch, but his right hand moved 2 inches to the right, toward the edge of the desk, toward whatever was mounted underneath it. A button. A switch. Something that connected to something else that would bring men, or noise, or both. I wouldn't, Deacon said quietly. Move your hand back to the center of the desk. Do it now. Eli's eyes shifted to Deacon, calculated. Then his hand moved back. The smile returned, thinner now, tighter, the smile of a man who was still confident but had just been reminded that confidence and safety were not the same thing. The records, Graves said. The originals. Names of buyers. Transport logs. Financial records. Blackmail files. Everything. Ah, so that's the play. Not just the girl. Everything. Eli leaned back in his chair. You know what happens if those records get out? It's not just me who falls. It's judges, county commissioners, 2 state legislators, a police chief, an assistant U.S. attorney. He paused. Let the weight of that settle. You pull that thread, the entire garment unravels, and some of the people wearing that garment will burn this house to the ground, with everyone in it, before they let their names become public. I don't care who falls. You should, because some of the people on that list have the authority to make you and your club disappear. Not metaphorically, actually disappear. No trial, no arrest, just gone. And the boy you're protecting, the one sitting on the back of that giant's motorcycle in my tree line, he disappears too. And nobody asks questions because nobody knows he existed. The room was very still. The coffee on Eli's desk sent a thin thread of steam into the air. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something listening. You've been watching us since the gate, Deacon said. I've been watching you since the diner. Eli's smile widened. You think those trucks on the mountain were improvised? I knew where the boy would run. I knew which diner was open. I knew your club was on the highway because I've had GPS tags on 4 of your bikes for the past 6 months. Vernon was supposed to retrieve the bag quietly. When your club intervened, the plan adapted. Every move you've made since midnight has been inside my field of vision. Graves absorbed this without visible reaction. But inside his chest, something collapsed. The last structural support of the belief that he had been making choices, that he had been driving events, that he had been the agent rather than the subject of a plan designed by someone who understood logistics the way surgeons understood anatomy. You wanted us here, Graves said. I wanted you here. Specifically you. The club is incidental. Why? Eli stood, slowly, buttoned his sweater with the precise, unhurried motions of a man for whom time was a resource he controlled rather than a pressure he endured. He walked to the window and looked out at the fog-covered property. The bag the boy stole contains copies, fragments, enough to cause problems but not enough to destroy the network. The originals are here, yes, in a safe in this house, but the safe requires 2 biometric signatures to open. Mine, he turned back to Graves, and yours. Silence. Excuse me, Deacon said. When I built the safe, I needed a failsafe. Someone whose biometric data I could obtain without their knowledge or cooperation. A family member's DNA, fingerprints, and retinal pattern are remarkably easy to acquire when you know where to look. Military service records, VA medical files. The federal government has everything, Dell. You just have to know who to ask or who to pay. Graves stared at his brother. The mathematics of it assembled in his mind with sickening clarity. The safe required his biometric data to open. Eli had programmed it that way deliberately, which meant the records, the originals, the complete files, the material that could dismantle the entire network, were locked behind a door that only the 2 of them could open together. And Eli had designed it so that if anyone ever tried to force him to open it, law enforcement, rivals, partners who lost their nerve, he could truthfully say that he couldn't open it alone, that his brother was needed, that the brother was a decorated Marine veteran with no criminal record connected to the operation, a man whose involvement would complicate any prosecution, a man whose biometric data in the safe system would create the appearance of complicity even if no complicity existed. You built me into it, Graves said. His voice was barely above a whisper. You made me part of the lock so that if anybody ever came for you, I'd look like part of the operation. Insurance, Eli said. Not leverage. Insurance. You son of a... Graves moved, fast. The desk was between them, but he went around it in 2 strides and grabbed Eli by the front of his sweater with both hands and drove him backward into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. Eli's head hit the stone behind the drywall, and his eyes unfocused for a half-second before snapping back with the cold clarity of a man who had calculated this moment and decided it was survivable. "Do it," Eli said through gritted teeth. "Beat me, break me, kill me if you want. The safe stays locked, the records stay sealed, the network keeps running, and Gracie Dunmore stays in that room upstairs until someone moves her to the next location on the schedule, which is," he glanced at the clock on the wall, "approximately 4 hours from now." Graves's fists tightened in the sweater fabric, his knuckles pressed against Eli's collarbones. He could feel his brother's heartbeat through the layers of cloth, steady, controlled, the heartbeat of a man who had prepared for this confrontation the way he prepared for everything, with systems and contingencies and the mechanical certainty that human emotion was a variable that could be predicted and managed. "Let him go," Deacon said. "Deacon, let him go. He wants you angry. Angry men don't think, and we need you thinking." Graves held his brother against the wall for 3 more seconds. Then he released him, stepped back. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the physical aftermath of rage compressed and redirected, the tremor of a body that had been about to do something irreversible and was now processing the chemical consequences of not doing it. Eli straightened his sweater, touched the back of his head, looked at his fingers. No blood. He smiled again, that same controlled, evaluative smile that treated every interaction as a transaction and every transaction as a game he'd already won. "The offer is simple," Eli said. "You open the safe with me. I give you the girl. You walk out. The copies in the bag, the ones the boys stole. I need those back. That's the trade. The girl for the bag. The records stay sealed. The network continues. And you never hear from me again." "And the other children? What about them?" "The ones in the photographs. The 14 faces. Gracie Dunmore isn't the only one." Eli tilted his head, the gesture of a man recalibrating a negotiation. "I'm offering you one. That's more than anyone else has offered. Take the one. Go home. Be the hero for one little girl. That's more than most people get." Graves looked at Deacon. Deacon's face was stone. His eyes were calculation machines running scenarios, measuring probabilities, evaluating options with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent years making tactical decisions in environments where the penalty for error was death. "We need the room," Deacon said to Eli. 2 minutes. Take your time. The fog isn't going anywhere." Graves and Deacon stepped into the hallway. The door was open behind them. Neither man was willing to let Eli out of line of sight. They stood close together, voices barely above breath. "It's a trap inside a trap," Deacon said. "He wants you to open the safe because he needs the safe opened. Something's changed. The copies the kid stole are enough to threaten him, but the originals in the safe are his real insurance. If we take the copies and leave, he still has the originals in the network. But if we open the safe, he gets the originals out, moves them, destroys them, transfers them, and the insurance is gone. The whole thing becomes untraceable. So he wants me to help him destroy his own evidence. He wants you to think you're liberating it, but the second that safe opens, he controls what happens to everything inside. He'll hand you the girl and keep the records, and by the time you realize what happened, the files are ash and the network is invisible." Graves leaned against the wall, closed his eyes. The exhaustion hit him all at once. The accumulated weight of a sleepless night, a mountain escape, a 2-hour ride through freezing wind, and the revelation that his own brother had been building a machine of human suffering for over a decade and had wired Graves into it without his knowledge or consent. "What do we do?" Graves asked. Not as a president asking his sergeant-at-arms, as a man asking the only other man in the building he trusted completely. Deacon was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, more deliberate, as if each word was being placed with the precision of a demolition charge. "We open the safe. You just said, we open the safe. We get the records. We get the girl. And we don't let him control what happens next." Deacon paused. "I made a phone call. At the gas station. While you were looking at that photograph on your phone, I called a number I haven't used in 8 years. A woman I served with who went federal after she got out. She's not on anyone's payroll. She's not connected to anyone in this region. She's driving here from Lexington right now, and she's bringing people with her. Graves opened his eyes. You called a Fed, without telling me. I called a Fed because I knew we'd end up here. In a house, with a man who's smarter than us, needing something we couldn't get with fists and Harleys. Deacon met his eyes. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I wasn't sure you'd say yes. And we needed a yes. The hallway was silent. The two men stood in it like figures in a painting, one leaning against the wall with his eyes red and his hands still shaking, the other standing straight with his prosthetic hand at his side, and the absolute stillness of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with the consequences. How long? Graves asked. She said 90 minutes from the gas station. That was 70 minutes ago. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. We need him talking for 20 minutes. We need the safe open and the records visible when she walks through that door so there's no question about what's in this house and who put it here. Graves pushed off the wall, straightened his cut, rolled his shoulders. The shaking in his hands slowed, stopped. His jaw set into the hard line that his brothers recognized as the moment when Graves stopped being a man with doubts and became a man with a direction. I'll open the safe. And the girl? We get her first. Before the safe, before anything. We get her out of whatever room she's in, and we put her in Rook's hands and she leaves this property. That's not negotiable. That's not part of the trade. That happens first or nothing happens. They walked back into the study. Eli was seated at his desk again, drinking coffee as though the last 5 minutes had been a commercial break in a program he was enjoying. Decision? Eli said. The girl comes out first. Right now. She walks out the front door and she leaves with my people. Then I open the safe. Eli considered this. His fingers tapped the desk once, a single drum roll of calculation. Acceptable. He stood, led them to the staircase. They climbed to the second floor. Eli first, then Graves, then Deacon 3 steps behind with his hand inside his jacket. The hallway above was carpeted in dark blue. 4 doors, all closed. Eli stopped at the third door, produced a key from his pocket, unlocked it. The room was small, clean, a single bed with white sheets, a nightstand with a glass of water and a plate of crackers, a window with bars on the outside, and in the corner, sitting on the floor with her knees drawn to her chest and her arms wrapped around her shins, a girl. Brown hair, small, 8 years old, wearing a sweater that was too big for her and socks that didn't match, and the expression of a human being who had stopped processing fear because fear had become the baseline of her existence. Not an emotion, but an environment, like air or gravity, something she lived inside rather than something she felt. She looked up when the door opened. Her eyes went to Eli first, then to Graves, then to Deacon. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She waited. With the terrible patience of a child who had learned that the people who open doors were never the people who set you free. Graves knelt, the way he'd knelt in front of Noah in the basement, eye level, no authority in the posture, just presence. Gracie. The girl's eyes widened slightly at the sound of her name, as if she'd forgotten she had one. My name is Dell. I'm here to take you out of this house. There's a man outside, a really big man named Rook, and he's going to take you somewhere safe. Right now, not later, not tomorrow. Right now. The girl didn't move. Her fingers were white around her shins. You don't have to trust me, Graves said. You just have to walk with me to the front door. Can you do that? Gracie Dunmore, 8 years old, missing since October, last seen on a highway poster that 12 million people had driven past without stopping, looked at the man kneeling in front of her and did something that cracked every person in the room in a place they didn't know they could still be cracked. She reached out and touched the iron vulture's patch on his chest, traced the outline of the vulture with one finger. Then she stood up and took his hand. Graves led her down the stairs, through the foyer, out the front door, into the fog. Rook was already at the gate. He'd heard the door and moved forward with the instinct of a man who could sense the weight of a child's footsteps from 50 yards. Gracie saw him and stopped. A 300-pound man in a leather cut with scars on his face and hands the size of dinner plates. She should have been terrified, Every survival instinct in her body should have told her to run. She walked to him, lifted her arms. Rook picked her up and held her against his chest, and she buried her face in his neck and made a sound. Small, broken, ancient. The sound of a child exhaling for the first time in months. Rook's eyes met Graves's over the girl's head. They were streaming. He didn't wipe them, didn't hide them, just stood there in the fog with a child in his arms and tears on his face and the terrible, beautiful expression of a man who had finally found the thing he'd been built to do. "Go," Graves said. "Take her and Noah. Get to the highway. Don't stop." Rook turned, carried Gracie to the bikes. Noah was standing beside the Harley, and when he saw the girl, his face changed. Recognition, not of her specifically, but of what she represented. Another child. Another survivor. Another piece of evidence that the world he'd been trapped in was real, and he wasn't crazy, and somebody had finally come. Rook mounted the bike with Gracie in front of him and Noah behind, both children pressed against his body like passengers on a lifeboat, and he fired the engine and rolled down the driveway and through the gate and disappeared into the fog. Another brother followed, unnamed, unspeaking, providing escort without being asked. Graves watched them go. Then he turned back toward the house. Deacon was at the front door. Eli was visible through the foyer window, standing at the base of the stairs with his arms crossed and the smile still on his face. The smile of a man who had given up a pawn and still believed he was 3 moves from checkmate. 14 minutes. Deacon's contact was 14 minutes away. 14 minutes of keeping Eli talking. 14 minutes of standing inside a house built on the bones of children and pretending to negotiate with the architect. Graves walked back through the front door. "The safe," he said. Eli led them to the basement. Not the kind of basement the clubhouse had, raw concrete and bare bulbs and the smell of damp earth. This was finished, carpeted, climate-controlled, a room that looked like a corporate server vault, with steel shelving along the walls and a bank of monitors showing camera feeds from every angle of the property, and at the far end, a safe the size of a commercial freezer set into the reinforced wall, biometric panel on the front, retinal scanner, fingerprint pad, 2-person authentication system built to the specifications of a man who planned for every contingency except the one he couldn't control, his own blood walking through the front door with federal agents 20 minutes behind him. Eli placed his hand on the fingerprint pad, leaned into the retinal scanner. The safe beeped once. "Your turn," he said. Graves looked at the safe, looked at Deacon, looked at the monitors on the wall, which showed the fog-covered property and the empty driveway and the tree line where his brothers waited in positions they'd held for the past 30 minutes, without complaint and without question. On one of the monitors, the one showing the road below the property, headlights appeared, moving fast. Multiple vehicles, not trucks, sedans, dark, official. Deacon saw it too. His expression didn't change, but his weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet, the unconscious preparation of a man whose body was aligning itself with the moment it had been waiting for. Eli hadn't seen the monitors. His eyes were on Graves. His hand was extended toward the fingerprint pad. His smile was intact, the smile of a man standing at the finish line of a race he'd been running for 17 years. "Open it, Dell. Take what's inside. Walk away. This all ends." Graves stepped to the safe, placed his hand on the fingerprint pad. The surface was cold against his skin. He leaned toward the retinal scanner. The red light swept across his eye. The safe clicked. The bolts disengaged with a heavy mechanical sound that echoed through the basement like a heartbeat stopping and restarting. Above them, the front door of the house opened, boots on the foyer tile, multiple sets, moving fast. And a voice, a woman's voice, sharp and authoritative, carrying down the stairwell with the kind of clarity that came from years of announcing the same words in the same tone in dozens of doorways across dozens of operations. "Federal agents, nobody moves." Eli's smile died, not slowly, not gradually. It was there, and then it wasn't. Replaced by something Graves had never seen on his brother's face in 40 years of shared existence. Surprise. Genuine, unscripted, uncalculated surprise. The expression of a man who had accounted for every variable except the possibility that his own brother's sergeant-at-arms had made a phone call at a gas station. Eli lunged for the safe. Graves caught him, both hands around his brother's arms, pivoting, slamming him sideways into the steel shelving with enough force to scatter file boxes across the floor. Eli fought, not with the trained precision of a fighter, but with the desperate, graceless violence of a man whose entire world was collapsing and whose only instinct was to reach the evidence before someone else did. "It's over," Graves said through his teeth. His face was inches from his brother's. Their eyes were identical, same color, same shape, same genetic architecture. And in that proximity, in that moment, with federal boots thundering on the stairs above them and the safe door swinging open behind them and 17 years of silence collapsing into a single point of contact, Graves could see in his brother's eyes the thing that Eli had spent his entire life hiding from everyone, including himself. Fear. "You can't do this to me," Eli whispered. "I'm your brother. I'm your blood." "You were," Graves said. "You were." The basement door burst open. Flashlights, weapons, voices calling commands with the rehearsed precision of people who did this for a living. Deacon stepped back against the wall with both hands visible, his prosthetic catching the flashlight beam and reflecting it like a signal mirror. He was already talking, already identifying himself, already providing the narrative framework that would separate the iron vultures from the contents of this basement in whatever reports were written in the hours and days to come. And Graves held his brother against the steel shelving and watched the federal agents pour into the room and felt something release inside his chest. Not triumph, not relief, but the structural collapse of a weight he hadn't known he was carrying until the moment it was finally, irreversibly gone. The weight of a name, the weight of blood, the weight of being connected by biology to a man who had turned children into freight and called it business. They pulled Eli away from him, cuffed his hands behind his back, read him words that Eli had probably memorized years ago in preparation for a moment he believed would never actually arrive. Graves stood in the center of the basement and watched his brother being led toward the stairs and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not sadness. Nothing. The hollow, ringing nothing that exists at the center of an explosion after the sound has passed and the debris has settled, and all that's left is the silence of a thing that used to be standing and isn't anymore. Then, from above, from outside, through the open basement door and up the stairwell and through the foyer and out the front door and across the fog-covered property, a sound, an engine, not a sedan, not a truck, a motorcycle, a Harley, coming fast, coming up the driveway, coming with the unmistakable urgency of a rider who was not arriving on schedule but arriving in crisis. Kane's voice through the radio, breathless, ragged, broken. "Graves, they hit Rook, on the highway, 2 miles south, Vernon's people. They ran him off the road. Rook's down. The kids are..." Static, wind, the sound of an engine revving. "Graves, the kids are gone. Vernon has them. Vernon has both kids." Graves was on his bike before the radio transmission finished. He didn't give orders, he didn't coordinate, he didn't think. He simply moved. Through the basement, up the stairs, past the federal agent still securing the house, out the front door, across the gravel driveway, through the open gate, and onto the Harley with the engine firing before his boots hit the pegs. Deacon was 3 seconds behind him. Then Wren. Then 4 brothers who had been holding perimeter in the tree line and heard Kane's transmission and didn't need to be told what it meant. 7 bikes tore south on the highway through fog so thick that the road disappeared 10 feet ahead of each front wheel. Graves rode by instinct and fury, leaning into curves he couldn't see, accelerating through straightaways he was guessing at, his body operating on the ancient circuitry of a combat marine whose nervous system had been rewired by war to function at maximum capacity precisely when rational thought shut down. 2 miles. Kane had said 2 miles south. Graves counted distance by engine RPM and elapsed seconds, the way he'd been trained to estimate range in terrain where landmarks didn't exist. 90 seconds at this speed. 90 seconds between the gate and whatever was waiting on the highway. He saw the wreckage first. Rook's Harley lay on its side in the gravel shoulder, the front wheel still spinning slowly, the chrome catching the flat gray light and throwing it back in broken patterns. Debris spread across the road, shattered taillight glass, A side mirror, deep black skid marks that told the story of a bike forced sideways by something larger and heavier and moving with deliberate intent. A guardrail was bent inward where something had struck it with tremendous force. Rook was on the ground beside the guardrail, on his back, not moving. Kane knelt beside him, one hand pressed against Rook's ribs, the other holding the radio. Blood covered Kane's fingers. It covered the gravel. It covered the front of Rook's cut in a dark spreading stain that looked black in the fog. Graves dropped his bike and ran. His knees hit the gravel beside Rook, and his hands found the big man's face and turned it toward him. Rook's eyes were open, conscious, but the pupils were uneven and his breathing came in short, wet gasps that meant something inside was broken, or bleeding, or both. "Where?" Graves said. One word, all he could manage. Truck came from the side road. Rook's voice was a rasp, the sound of air being forced through a throat that didn't want to cooperate. "Hit us broadside. I went down. Tried to cover the kids." He paused, coughed. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth and he wiped it away with the back of his hand like it was an inconvenience rather than a symptom. "Vernon, he was in the truck. He took them, both of them, headed south on 63. How long ago?" 5 minutes, maybe less. Graves looked at Deacon. Deacon was already on the phone, calling the federal agent at Eli's house, relaying the situation, requesting vehicles, requesting backup, requesting the machinery of institutional response that moved at the speed of procedure rather than the speed of desperation. 5 minutes. A truck moving at highway speed covered 5 miles in 5 minutes. But the roads south of Jellicoe were mountain roads, curves, switchbacks, construction zones, the narrow 2-lane corridors that wound through the Cumberland Gap country toward Harrogate and the Tennessee line. A truck couldn't outrun a motorcycle on those roads, not if the motorcycle was ridden by a man who didn't care about speed limits or ice or the thin margin between asphalt and the vertical drop into the valley below. "Stay with him," Graves said to Kane. "Don't let him move." "Graves?" Rook grabbed his arm. The grip was weak, nothing like the force those hands normally carried, but the desperation in it was absolute. "Bring them back. Whatever it takes, bring them back." Graves looked at the man who had sat in a chair all night guarding a sleeping child. The man who had carried Gracie Dunmore out of a locked room and held her against his chest while tears ran down his face. The man who was now lying in his own blood on a frozen highway because he'd put his body between 2 children and a truck, and the truck had won. "I'll bring them back." He mounted his bike. Deacon mounted behind him. There wasn't time to retrieve his own machine. 2 brothers followed, 4 bikes heading south on Route 63 at speeds that turned the fog into a tunnel and the road into a blur and the world into nothing but the sound of engines and the white line disappearing beneath the front wheel. Graves found the truck 4 miles south, just past the junction where Route 63 curved hard to the west and crossed a narrow bridge over a frozen creek. A black Ford F250, the same model Wren had identified on the mountain, pulled to the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. The driver's door was open, the engine was running, and Vernon Hale stood beside the truck with a shotgun in his hands, and Noah Ryder gripped by the collar in his left fist, and Gracie Dunmore standing frozen beside the rear tire with the expression of a child who had been rescued and unrescued within the same hour, and whose capacity for hope had been so thoroughly exhausted that she could no longer produce the emotion required to scream. Graves didn't slow down. He aimed the Harley at the shoulder and braked hard 20 feet from the truck, the rear tire locking and sliding on frozen gravel, the bike coming to rest at an angle that put his body between Vernon's shotgun and the open road behind him. Vernon was 46 years old, heavy through the middle, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, small eyes pushed too close together, a forehead that sloped backward into a receding hairline, a jaw that didn't quite align with the rest of his skull. He wore a canvas work jacket and steel-toed boots, and the particular expression of a man who had spent his entire life wielding power over people who couldn't fight back, and was now, for the first time, standing in front of someone who could. "Back off," Vernon said. His voice was higher than expected, thin, reedy, the voice of a man whose authority had always been borrowed from the men above him, and was now, with those men being handcuffed in a basement in Jellicoe, rapidly depreciating. "I'll kill him. I swear I'll do it." Noah hung from Vernon's grip like a puppet. His feet barely touched the ground. His face was white. But his eyes, those dark, ancient, calculating eyes, were fixed on Graves with an expression that wasn't fear. It was expectation. The specific, crystallized expectation of a child who had chosen to trust one man in a world of men who had failed him, and was now watching to see whether that trust would be honored or added to the long list of promises that adults made and broke like cheap glass. Graves dismounted, slowly, hands visible. He took one step forward, then another. The shotgun tracked him. Vernon's hands were shaking badly enough that the barrel wobbled in small circles, which made it more dangerous rather than less, because a shaking hand on a trigger was a hand that could fire by accident as easily as by intent. "Vernon, look at me." "Stay back." "Look at me. It's over. Eli is in federal custody. The house is seized. The records are being opened right now. Every name, every route, every transaction. There's nowhere to go. There's nobody coming to help you. The men who were on that mountain, the men in the trucks, they're gone. They left when they figured out the math changed. You're the only one who hasn't figured it out yet." Vernon's jaw worked. His eyes darted. To the road, to the fog, to the tree line, calculating escape routes that didn't exist. The shotgun barrel trembled. Noah hung motionless in his grip, arms limp, the learned passivity of a child who knew that struggling against a man like Vernon always made things worse. "I'm not going to prison," Vernon said. "You understand? I can't. They'll kill me in there. The men I worked for, they'll reach me. They'll put the boy down." No, he's my insurance. That's what Eli calls it. Insurance. You don't touch the man holding the insurance." Deacon had dismounted behind Graves. He stood perfectly still, his prosthetic hand catching the flat light, his real hand at his side, his body positioned at an angle that gave him a line on Vernon that didn't intersect with Noah. He was waiting, measuring, doing the math that snipers do: distance, wind, angle, probability. The math that turned a human being into a geometry problem. Graves took another step. He was 12 feet from Vernon now, close enough to see the sweat on the man's forehead despite the freezing air, close enough to see the yellow nicotine stains on the fingers wrapped around the shotgun's fore end, close enough to see the face of the man who had beaten Noah Ryder for 3 years and moved children in trucks and called it work. "Vernon, I'm going to tell you something and I need you to hear it, not as a threat, as a fact." Graves' voice was low and even, and carried the weight of a man who had stopped being afraid an hour ago and was now operating in the territory beyond fear, where choices were simple and consequences were accepted in advance. "You can point that shotgun at me. You can point it at the sky. You can point it at the ground. But you're going to let go of that boy, because if you don't, if you hurt him, if you take him, if you do anything other than set him down and step back, there is no version of what happens next that ends with you walking away. Not from me. Not from the men behind me. Not from the federal agents who are 4 minutes down this road. There is no insurance. There is no leverage. There is just a man holding a child and 12 men who have already decided what they're willing to do about it." Vernon's breathing was ragged. His grip on Noah's collar tightened. The shotgun barrel rose an inch toward Graves's chest, toward the center mass that every frightened man aims for because the body is easier to hit than the courage required to pull the trigger. Noah spoke. His voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a 9-year-old who had spent 3 years surviving a monster by understanding exactly how the monster worked. "Vernon, they're going to hurt you if you don't let go. You know they are. These aren't the men from the trucks. These aren't men who take orders. These are the men from the diner. The ones you told me to stay away from. The ones you said were dangerous." Vernon looked down at the boy in his grip. Something crossed his face. Not remorse, not guilt, but the dim animal recognition that the child he'd treated as property for 3 years was now speaking to him as an equal. And the shift in power that this represented was more terrifying than the bikers, or the federal agents, or the collapsing network. "You shut your mouth," Vernon whispered. "You're scared," Noah said. You've been scared since I took the bag. You've been scared your whole life. That's why you hurt people smaller than you, because hurting them is the only time you're not scared." Vernon's face contorted. His hand released Noah's collar, not gently, not deliberately, but with the reflexive rejection of a man who had been seen clearly for the first time and couldn't stand the reflection. Noah dropped to the ground, hit the frozen gravel on his hands and knees, scrambled forward toward Graves with the desperate velocity of a child covering the last few feet between captivity and freedom. Graves caught him, pulled him behind his body, shielded him with the mass and leather and bone that stood between the boy and the shotgun. Vernon stood alone beside his truck. The shotgun hung in his hands like something he'd forgotten how to use. His eyes were empty. His mouth was open. The fog closed around him like a curtain being drawn across a stage where the performance had ended and the actor had forgotten his final line. He dropped the shotgun. It clattered on the gravel. He sank to his knees, put his hands on the back of his head, and he stayed there, kneeling on the frozen shoulder of a mountain highway in the fog, with the engine of his truck still running and the hazard lights still flashing, and a little girl standing 10 feet away watching him with eyes that would carry the memory of his face for the rest of her life. Deacon cuffed him with a zip tie from his jacket pocket. Quick. Efficient. No more force than necessary. Then he walked to Gracie, knelt in front of her, and spoke to her in a voice so low that nobody else could hear what he said. Whatever it was, it made her nod. Then she walked to Graves, who was still holding Noah against his chest. And she took Noah's hand, and the two children stood together on the side of the road, holding hands while the fog thinned and the first pale light of a winter sun appeared above the mountains to the east. The federal vehicles arrived 4 minutes later. 3 black sedans and an SUV, agents in tactical gear. A woman, mid-40s, short hair, the bearing of someone who had served in places where bearing was the difference between authority and chaos, stepped out of the lead vehicle and walked directly to Deacon. They didn't shake hands, didn't exchange pleasantries. She looked at Vernon on his knees, looked at the children, looked at Graves. Then she nodded once, the nod of a professional acknowledging that the messiest possible version of a field operation had somehow produced the necessary result. "The house?" she asked Deacon. "Secured. Safe is open. Records are intact. Eli Mercer is in custody. The children?" "These 2 in a basement full of files pointing to dozens more. Locations, names, dates, everything the network used to move them." The woman, Agent Keene, though Graves would not learn her name until days later, looked at him with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something harder to categorize. Respect, maybe, or the particular kind of recognition that one damaged person extends to another when they realize they've been fighting the same war from different sides of the same broken system. "Your club is going to have questions to answer," she said. "We'll answer them. Some of those answers might not be comfortable. Comfortable left the building about 12 hours ago." She almost smiled, didn't. Turned to her agents and began issuing orders with the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who understood that the operation was over, but the work was just beginning. They took Vernon away in the back of an SUV. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He sat behind the tinted glass with his zip-tied hands in his lap and stared at nothing while the vehicle pulled onto the highway and disappeared south into the fog. The Iron Vultures regrouped at the bridge. Rook was there, transported by Kane in the bed of a pickup truck commandeered from a farmhouse half a mile from the crash site, lying on a moving blanket with his hand pressed against his ribs and his face the color of old concrete. 2 broken ribs. A lacerated spleen. Road rash from his left shoulder to his hip. He'd refused to go to the hospital until he saw the children. Kane hadn't argued. There was no point arguing with Rook about anything, and especially no point arguing with Rook about children. When Noah and Gracie walked to the truck, Rook sat up. The movement cost him. Graves could see it in the way his jaw locked and his eyes narrowed and his breathing went shallow. But he sat up and he looked at both children, and he counted them and confirmed them and satisfied whatever mechanism inside his chest needed to verify that the 2 small humans he'd been entrusted with were still present and still breathing. "Hey kids," Rook said. His voice was wrecked, gravel and blood and exhaustion. "You're hurt," Noah said. "I've been hurt before. Comes with the job." "What job?" Rook looked at the boy for a long time, then at Gracie. then at the sky, where the fog was breaking apart and the first real sunlight was spearing through the clouds in long diagonal shafts that lit up the frozen landscape like something being revealed for the first time. "This one," Rook said. They got him to a hospital in Middlesbrough. The Iron Vultures filled the emergency room waiting area like an occupying force. 12 men in leather cuts and road-worn boots, bleeding from various minor injuries, smelling like exhaust and sweat and cold air, occupying every chair and leaning against every wall while nurses and orderlies navigated around them with the careful precision of people moving through a room full of large, unpredictable objects. Nobody asked them to leave. Nobody asked them to be quiet. They simply existed in that waiting room with the specific gravity of men who had earned the right to sit down and were not going to move until they were ready. Noah sat beside Graves. The boy hadn't let go of his hand since the highway. Not in the truck, not in the parking lot, not in the elevator. His small fingers were locked around Graves's scarred knuckles with the grip of someone holding a rope over a canyon. Total, desperate, unrelenting. "Is Rook going to die?" Noah asked. "No." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen men die and I've seen men fight. Rook's fighting." Noah considered this. His dark eyes moved around the waiting room, cataloging the faces of the men who had ridden through a blizzard, escaped down a logging trail, confronted a trafficking kingpin, and chased a truck down a mountain highway for him. Men with broken noses and split knuckles, and the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than muscles and bones, the exhaustion of people who had poured everything they had into a single night and were now running on the fumes of whatever remained. "Are you going to give me back?" Noah asked. Graves looked down at him. "Give you back to who?" "The system. Foster care. A group home. Another family that looks good on paper." The boy's voice was flat, rehearsed, the voice of a child who had already mapped the trajectory of his future and found it indistinguishable from his past. "Is that what you want?" "It doesn't matter what I want. That's how it works. I'm 9. Nobody asks what I want." Graves said nothing for a long time. He looked at his hand, the scarred knuckles, the calloused fingers, the hand of a man who had been told by a family court judge 4 years ago that he wasn't fit to raise a child. He looked at the boy's hand inside his, small, thin, cold, gripping with the strength of someone who had been let go so many times that holding on had become the only skill that mattered. "I'm going to tell you something," Graves said, "and I don't know if it's a promise or just the truth, but right now those are the same thing. Nobody is giving you back to anything. Not tonight, not tomorrow. Whatever happens next, courts, paperwork, people in offices with clipboards, you're not going back to a house like Vernon's house. That's done. That's over. I don't care what the system says. I don't care what the paperwork says. That's done." Noah searched his face, the same way he'd searched it in the diner, the same way he'd searched it in the basement, the same arithmetic of trust, measuring the distance between a man's words and a man's actions, calculating the probability of betrayal based on a lifetime of data points that all pointed in the same direction. But this time the calculation produced a different result, because this time the data had changed. This time, a man had ridden through a blizzard and faced down armed traffickers and confronted his own brother and chased a truck down a frozen highway and taken a position between a shotgun and a child's body. The data had changed. The math had changed. And Noah Ryder, 9 years old, 80 pounds, bruised and exhausted and carrying the weight of secrets that would have crushed most adults, let out a long, shaking breath and leaned sideways and pressed his head against Graves's arm and closed his eyes. He was asleep within 30 seconds. The first real sleep he'd had in months, maybe years. The boneless, surrendered sleep of a child who had finally found something solid enough to lean against. Graves sat very still. He didn't move his arm, didn't shift his weight, didn't reach for his phone or his cigarettes or anything that would require disturbing the small body pressed against him. He just sat there in the emergency room waiting area with a sleeping child against his arm, and the sound of his brother's breathing around him, and the slow, relentless tick of the clock on the wall marking the passage of time into something that felt, for the first time in years, like it might be moving toward rather than away from something worth reaching. Rook came out of surgery 3 hours later. 2 broken ribs pinned, spleen repaired. A a concussion that the doctor described as significant, with the particular understatement that medical professionals used when they meant, "You're lucky you're not dead." He was conscious, irritable, demanding to know where the children were before asking where his own body parts were. A nurse told him he needed to rest. He told her he'd rest when he was done. She didn't ask what he meant by done. Something in his face made the question unnecessary. The days that followed moved with the peculiar rhythm of aftermath, fast in some places, slow in others, like a river adjusting to a new landscape after a flood. Federal agents executed warrants across 4 counties in Tennessee and Kentucky. 23 arrests in the first week, 41 by the end of the month. Deputies, county officials, truck drivers, motel owners, the small, ordinary people who had formed the connective tissue of a network that moved children the way other networks moved contraband, efficiently, invisibly, and with the institutional indifference of a system that treated human suffering as a logistics problem. 11 children were recovered alive in the first 72 hours, found in houses, motels, and the back rooms of businesses that looked normal from the street and contained horrors behind their locked doors. Each recovery was a wound and a healing simultaneously. The wound of seeing what had been done to them, the healing of knowing that the doing was over. Social workers and counselors and the slow, patient machinery of care moved in behind the federal agents like medics moving in behind soldiers, tending to damage that would take years, maybe lifetimes, to fully address. Gracie Dunmore was reunited with her grandmother on a Tuesday afternoon in a social services office in Cookeville. The grandmother, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and hands that shook, and eyes that hadn't stopped crying since October, dropped to her knees on the office floor and held the girl so tightly that the social worker had to gently suggest she loosen her grip so the child could breathe. Gracie didn't let go. She held on with the ferocity of a person who had learned what it meant to be separated from the only safe place she'd ever known, and who would spend the rest of her life holding on tighter than other people because she understood what happened when you let go. Rook was there, standing in the hallway outside the office, leaning against the wall because his ribs wouldn't let him stand straight, watching through the glass partition as the grandmother held the girl. He didn't go inside, didn't introduce himself, didn't need credit or acknowledgement or the kind of recognition that people expected when they did something extraordinary. He just stood there and watched and breathed and let the image settle into whatever part of his memory was reserved for the things that made the rest of it bearable. Eli Mercer was indicted on 47 federal counts. The records from the safe, the originals, the complete archive, filled 3 evidence trucks and took a team of analysts 4 months to fully catalog. The blackmail files were separated and handled through classified channels. Careers ended. Resignations were tendered. 2 state legislators stepped down within weeks of the arrests. A police chief in a small Kentucky town drove his cruiser into a lake on a Wednesday morning and was pulled out alive by a fisherman who happened to be casting from the bank. He was arrested at the hospital. The Iron Vultures were questioned, extensively, individually, in rooms with recording equipment and federal attorneys who asked precise questions and expected precise answers. Deacon's contact, Agent Keene, navigated the legal architecture with the careful expertise of someone who understood that the men who had broken the case were also men who lived outside the boundaries of conventional legality, and that the space between those 2 facts required a specific kind of institutional flexibility to manage. No charges were filed against the club. The official language described them as cooperating witnesses. The unofficial language, spoken in hallways and break rooms and the margins of reports that would never be made public, described them as what they were: men who did what the system couldn't or wouldn't. Spring came to the mountains the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, as if the cold was a tenant who had to be evicted rather than a season that had to change. Snow melted, creeks swelled. The bare trees along Interstate 81 began producing the first tentative green of new growth, and the roads that had been coated in ice and salt and the gray residue of winter gradually revealed themselves as black asphalt again, warm in the afternoon sun, open and running south. Graves sat outside Black Lantern Diner on a Tuesday evening in early April, his back against the brick wall, his Harley parked 3 feet away, a cigarette burning between fingers that still carried the scars of that night and would carry them for the rest of his life. The neon sign above the door had been repaired, All the letters worked now, buzzing pink against the twilight, casting a warm glow across the parking lot where a boy had stumbled through a snowstorm 4 months ago, carrying a black duffel bag and the last of his courage. The diner door opened. Noah walked out. He was taller now, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The kind of growth that happened when a child started eating 3 meals a day and sleeping through the night and living in a place where large hands reaching toward him meant comfort rather than pain. He wore a new jacket, new boots, a backpack slung over one shoulder with the casual weight of a kid coming from somewhere normal. School, maybe, or a friend's house, or any of the unremarkable places that children were supposed to go and that Noah Ryder was only now, at 9 years and 4 months old, beginning to discover existed. He sat down next to Graves. Didn't speak. Didn't need to. They sat together in the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something that language can't fully contain, the comfortable load-bearing silence of two humans who have seen each other at their worst and their most frightened and have decided without discussion that the scene was enough. The custody process was ongoing, complicated by the federal case, by Noah's status as a material witness, by the absence of any biological parent fit or willing to take him. The system moved slowly. Paperwork accumulated, hearings were scheduled and rescheduled, but in the interim, in the legal gray area between what was and what would be, Noah lived with Graves, in the clubhouse on Harlan Ridge, in a room that had been a storage closet and was now a bedroom, furnished with a bed and a desk and a lamp and a shelf of books that various iron vultures had contributed from sources ranging from personal libraries to gas station paperback racks. It was not a conventional arrangement. No social worker would have approved it on paper. No family court judge would have looked at a motorcycle club president with a PTSD diagnosis and a criminal history and said, yes, this is the appropriate placement for a traumatized child. But the system that was supposed to place Noah had already failed him once, had placed him with a mother who couldn't protect him and a stepfather who trafficked children. And the people who were supposed to evaluate fitness had already demonstrated their own unfitness by allowing a 9-year-old to slip through every net designed to catch him. So Noah stayed, and Graves stayed, and the Iron Vultures stayed, riding out every morning and coming home every evening to a clubhouse that now contained, in addition to its usual inventory of engine parts and ammunition and the accumulated debris of outlaw life, a 9-year-old boy who was learning slowly and imperfectly and with setbacks that sometimes looked like the end of the world, how to exist in a space where being small did not mean being unsafe. Rook visited every weekend, brought books, brought food, sat with Noah on the porch and didn't talk about anything important and didn't need to. Deacon came by twice a week, ostensibly to handle club business, but always finding a reason to stay an extra hour, always ending up at the kitchen table helping Noah with math homework that Deacon could solve in his head, but chose to work through step by step because the process was the point, not the answer. Kane built Noah a bookshelf, drove to the clubhouse on a Saturday morning with lumber in the back of his truck, and spent 4 hours measuring and cutting and sanding while Noah watched and handed him nails and asked questions that Kane answered with the gruff patience of a man who was not naturally good with children, but who was trying, visibly, effortfully, imperfectly trying, because trying was the only version of goodness available to men like him. The diner waitress, the woman who had locked the door that first night without being asked, started keeping a plate of pancakes warm on Saturday mornings, in case anybody from the club came by, in case anybody was hungry. She never said it was for Noah. She didn't need to. Graves smoked his cigarette down to the filter, crushed it under his boot. The evening was warm. The mountains were green. The highway hummed with traffic that meant nothing to him, people going places, carrying things, living lives that intersected with his only at this diner, at this moment, in the pink glow of a neon sign that had once been half dead and now burned with every letter intact. Graves? Yeah, kid. Are you going to see your daughter? The question landed in the silence like a stone dropped into deep water. Graves sat with it for a long time. The cigarette smoke had dissipated. The evening air smelled like pine and asphalt and the faint sweetness of something blooming in the woods behind the diner. I'm working on it, he said. What does that mean? It means I filed the papers. It means a judge is going to look at them. It means somebody in an office is going to decide whether I've changed enough to deserve to sit across a table from my own kid. Have you? Graves looked at the boy beside him, at the new jacket and the new boots, and the face that still carried the ghost of every bruise it had ever worn, but was just beginning, to produce expressions that had nothing to do with survival. Curiosity. Amusement. The first tentative experiments with joy, conducted carefully, like a scientist handling a substance that might be volatile. I don't know, Graves said, but I'm different than I was. I think that counts for something. Noah nodded. The nod of a 9-year-old philosopher who understood that different and better were not always the same thing, but that different was at least a direction, and direction was more than most people had. The diner door opened again. Rook stepped out holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Graves, looked at Noah, went back inside, came back with a hot chocolate, set it on the bench beside the boy. Then he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms and stood there, a 300-pound sentinel with healing ribs and a face full of scars, watching the road and the mountains and the evening light as if he was standing guard over something precious, which he was. One by one, the others appeared. Deacon pulling into the lot on his Harley, killing the engine, walking to the wall and leaning against it without a word. Wren drifting out of the diner with a sandwich and a nod. Kane arriving in his truck, parking beside the bikes, sitting on the tailgate with his boots hanging over the edge. The iron vultures assembling at Black Lantern Diner in the early evening, not because anyone had called a meeting or issued an order, but because this was where it started, and this was where they came when the noise of the world got too loud, and they needed to remember what silence sounded like when it wasn't filled with threat. Noah sipped his hot chocolate. Graves drank his coffee. The neon sign buzzed above them. The mountains darkened against a sky that was turning from blue to purple to the deep infinite black of an Appalachian night, and the first stars appeared above the ridgeline, like small cold fires burning in a darkness that went on forever. The engines started one by one, low, thunderous, filling the parking lot with the sound that these men carried with them everywhere, the sound of machines in motion and the restless refusal to be still. They would ride tonight. They always rode, down the mountain roads and through the small towns and past the highway posters that still showed the faces of children who hadn't been found yet. Children whose names were written on papers in offices where people worked late and tried hard and sometimes failed. Children who were waiting in locked rooms and truck beds and the dark spaces between the world that was supposed to protect them and the world that actually did. But tonight, before they rode, they sat. In the neon glow, in the silence, in the company of a boy who had walked into this diner carrying a bag and a prayer and had walked out carrying something heavier and more permanent, the knowledge that the most dangerous men in the mountains were also the only ones who came when the world went dark. Noah finished his hot chocolate, set the cup on the bench, looked up at Graves. Same time next week? Graves almost smiled. The expression didn't quite complete itself. It never did with him, but it started, and the starting was enough. Same time next week. The boy walked to Rook's bike, climbed on the back, held on. And the iron vultures rode out of the parking lot and into the night, their engines rumbling through the valley like a heartbeat, their headlights cutting white corridors through the darkness, moving south, moving forward, moving toward whatever came next with the quiet certainty of men who had learned that protection was not a job or a duty or a code, but a way of being, a thing you carried in your chest beside your damage and your silence and your scars, a thing that weighed nothing and cost everything and was the only thing, in the end, that made the ride worth taking.